and I'll turn it over to our friends from the governor's office.
Thank you, and welcome back to Frankfurt, and appreciate you making the drive and dealing with the Capitol complex right now. It's kind of in disarray, but I'm glad you all got in safely. Today's mission is twofold in its broadest sense. The first one is that we have to do the preliminary estimates. Before the last meeting, it was always an August, October, December type of deal, where we did planning estimates in August, preliminary estimates in October, and then official estimates in December. They changed that, and this will be the second cycle when we do preliminary estimates in September, and then official estimates in December by the 20th. The second part of our twofold mission is I think you all got a letter or a copy of a letter from State Budget Director John Hicks asking for an official revision of fiscal 26. They're doing budget planning, and there's lots of reasons that they would like an official revision to fiscal 26. Now, in case you're wondering, that doesn't at all bind you for the official estimates in December. I mean, just because we set an official estimate today for 26 doesn't mean that it sticks in December. We do another official estimate in December. But so that's our twofold mission. And we're going to follow the agenda we normally follow, which is starting with the economic outlook. We use S&P Global still. And Dr. Michael Jones usually leads us through that discussion. So I'm going to pull up his slides and yield to Michael.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is wonderful to see you all again. Obviously, we will have quite a bit to talk about. Let's put that into slideshow mode.
Oh, yes, sir.
Thank you so much. I'll pull that a little closer. So, as always, we are going to be presenting our presentation in terms of the control, the optimistic, and the pessimistic scenarios as defined by the S&P Global Forecast. As you might imagine, since the last time we were together, there has been a tremendous amount of activity and a tremendous amount of new information that has been provided, but there's also a tremendous amount of uncertainty as to what things in the economy will be having the largest impact. We have seen the passage of the Tax Reconciliation Act. We have seen the imposition of tariffs, broadly based across all essentially major trading partners, and of course with some of those trading partners facing higher levels than others. So in the S&P forecast, with a probability of 50% on the control scenario, we're expecting below trend growth overall, with real GDP growing at 1.8% for fiscal 26. We're continuing that to continue on into fiscal 27 and 28, with real GDP falling to 1.5% in fiscal 28. We expect business fixed investment to slow after the rescission of many of the incentives that were being provided under the CHIPS and also the Inflation Reduction Act. The expectation of S&P Global is that the new allowance of immediate expensing from the Tax Reconciliation Act, House Bill 1, will not compensate for the effectiveness of the tax credits to spur on growth. So that area, with the exception of AI data centers, is expected to begin to slow. Specifically, of course, in the area of things such as battery production facilities for electric cars and other physical chip production facilities. The expectation that was laid out in this forecast is for the Federal Reserve to act to reduce federal funds rates starting in December, although we all know that they are meeting today. And the expectation in the control forecast is for there to be 3 consecutive 25 basis points cuts achieving a long-term federal funds rate of approximately 2.75 to 3% by the end of calendar 26 or fiscal 27 second quarter. We expect trends in payroll growth to continue to decline. This forecast was prepared before the very large revisions that have been released by the BLS came out. To put it in terms of calendar terms, this was finalized in early August. So here we are mid-September, so there has been more information that has been learned as we have all watched the economic reporting news. But this forecast assumes that those trends will continue and that the unemployment rate will rise to a peak of approximately 4.5% by early calendar 27, fiscal 27 quarter 3. Now, as you might imagine, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty concerning tariffs. The baseline assumption is that the statutory effective rate, which we know is a defined term, statutory does not mean it's law, it just means the effective rate that is being imposed across all trading partners on average for non-petroleum imports is 21%. That is the expectation in the control forecast. This, being a relatively simple equation, higher tariffs lead to higher inflation, drives core PCE to 4% from our current 2.9% rate by fiscal 26 second quarter. It is then expected to moderate over time because, as we all know, people, firms, all the individuals that sum up to make macro policy, Dr. Bollinger, we know that people are going to respond to those tariffs. So while the statutory effective rate is assumed, and of course the statutory effective rate is the same across all forecasts because it's what is based on current policy, the average effective rate is assumed to be approximately 17% in the control scenario. And as you might imagine, that is going to differ across the different scenarios. So while, again, the effective statutory rate at 21%, we're assuming consumer response, and of course, consumers in this case meaning firms also, the effective rate is going to be approximately 17%. Now, in the pessimistic scenario, as you might imagine, we have a drastic uptick in what is essentially a trade war. The trading partners have a much more pronounced countermeasures. We, of course, end up in a more of a tit-for-tat stage. All of this leads to GDP growth slowing to 0.8% in fiscal 26 as compared to the 1.8% in the control scenario, and 1% in both 27 and 28. That compares to 2.3 and 1.5 in the control scenario. The effective rate is assumed to increase to 22% in the pessimistic scenario. So while, again, the statutory rate would not change by definition, the individual responses, specifically the countermeasures imposed by our trading partners, would increase the tariff rate to 22%. And again, with a relatively simple equation of higher tariffs lead to higher inflation. The pessimistic scenario assumes that combined with continued difficulty in the overall financial sector and the overall fiscal health of the of the nation. I was going to say the Commonwealth, but of the nation, leads to a much more pessimistic scenario than the control scenario. It also assumes that deportations, which are ongoing, happen faster and on a larger scale than what is assumed in the baseline forecast. The baseline forecast assumes we lose approximately, through both deportations and a lack of people moving into the country, of about a 500,000 decrease in overall worker population over the course of this forecast. That would be higher in the pessimistic scenario, which of course would put extra pressure on the costs and ability for markets that depend upon a lot of immigrant labor, such as housing, agriculture, etc. The pessimistic scenario assumes that the non-farm employment increases by only 0.2% in fiscal 26 versus the 0.7% you'll see in the control forecast. And then it decreases, a decline in non-farm employment of 0.7% and 0.5% respectively, fiscal 27 and 28. That is as compared to relatively slow growth, but positive growth in the control scenario. Consumer spending growth slows to 0.6% in fiscal 26 and 0.5% in fiscal 27 as compared to 1.5 and 2.1% in the control scenario. The unemployment rate, rather than the 4.5% we saw earlier, tops out at 6.3%. And overall weak demand lowers world oil prices to just under $50 a barrel by fiscal 27 quarter 3. That's as compared to approximately $57 in the control scenario. Now, in the pessimistic scenario, it's also assumed that the Federal Reserve will act much more aggressively in cutting rates. It assumes that the overall target rate for the Fed funds rate, as compared to the 2.75 to 3 in the control scenario, would be approximately 1.75 to 2. So essentially a 100 basis point difference in where the Fed ends up stopping rate cuts by the end of fiscal 27 Q2. Oh, and I neglected to mention, but you probably saw on the slide, the pessimistic scenario is weighted with 30% probability versus the control's 50% probability. The optimistic, as you might imagine, is much more optimistic, but it has a slightly lower weighting of only 20%. In this case, the GDP growth increases to 2.6 and 2.8% respectively in 26 and 27. That's as compared to 1.8 and 2.3 as we've mentioned in the control forecast. And here, essentially, it's the mirror image of what we were expecting in the pessimistic forecast. We see consumers experiencing lower tariff rates. The effective average tariff rate in the optimistic portfolio is only 13%. So again, 17% in the control scenario, 22% in the pessimistic scenario, and 13% in the optimistic scenario. Of course, the statutory rate would not change. Of course, it's what's written down. We also expect the employment increase to be a positive 0.9% in fiscal 26. That compares to the positive 0.7% in the control forecast. Real personal income is expected to grow by 2.3% versus the 0.2 and 0.4% in the control scenario. Housing starts are expected to be quite strong. Again, the optimistic scenario assumes that the population growth and increases as deportations slow and is not as broad as expected in the control scenario. And so housing starts increase 3.3% and 1.4% in fiscal 28 as compared to essentially flat to zero growth in the control. Consumer spending is expected to increase by 2.5 and 3% in fiscal 26 and 27 respectively. That compares to 1.5 and 2.1 in the control scenario. And the unemployment rate rises to only 4.3%, which of course is just slightly under the 4.5% we saw in the control forecast. So that lays out the general ground level, if you will, of what each is assuming. Obviously, there's more nuances to each scenario, and as we go through some of the slides, I will mention some of those. As always, we have prepared our control optimistic pessimistic line graph, so you can see the relative difference, obviously, in both vertical distance on the graph showing the difference between the scenarios, and of course the slope of the line, which is of course not a perfect representation of growth rates, but it gives a good idea of what we're expecting. And I think this first slide is exactly what is being laid out. Yes, sir.
Can I interrupt? I'm sorry. How, since we're going to be revising the current, the 26 fiscal year, do you have a sense for what, do you have a sense for which of the scenarios that we chose between 2 years ago is closest to what happened?
Well, now you're testing my memory.
Well, that's because mine completely failed. So, anything you have is at least that good.
Right. I would have to be relying upon my recollection now.
You can say, no, I don't know. That's a fine answer.
I was going to say, I don't know for sure, but everything else, I would say it's a slight blend between the control and the pessimistic as to what actually occurred. I think we also have to realize, if we think about the way we have seen the recent data come in, let's look at what happened in the first calendar quarter of this year. Every firm that could front-ran the tariffs. We saw massive increases in inventories, so much so that we saw the BEA had to come out and say, the normal data collection's not working here. We're going to make some adjustments to correct for this. Now, we all know, for those of us who've been made to teach macro, no one does it willingly, you always see that minus M for imports. And we know why that's there, but it's not truly that imports are a negative, it's that you don't want to double count. So the BEA said, we need to fix this. Well, what happened the very next quarter? Everything plunged. We saw a huge drop-off. Why? Because everybody had built inventories the previous quarter. And the BEA looked at the data and said, whoa, we need to make another adjustment. And so we saw 2 quarters that were literally mirror images of one another that had to have external adjustments by BEA to correct the magnitude of what was not being picked up.
And if you just added them together, you probably would have been about right.
That is true. We also saw, of course, that the AI boom, we have seen a contribution to GDP larger due to the purchase of chips, software, more than the consumer average retail purchases added to GDP. Now, that's a mixture of 2 things, an increase in the AI and expenditures, the CapEx, if you will, of what's being built up in the terms of data centers, and a strong decrease in consumer activity because, again, also consumers tried to front run any impact of tariffs. So we've seen a large magnitude. And when we were here 2 years ago, nobody had any idea that we would see something so recent that would have such a strong up and down impact on the data. But you're right, if you take the 2 in aggregate, it's only slightly more pessimistic than you would have expected overall if you had taken, for example, the straight pessimistic forecast last time. That would be my general thoughts. So, but if you would like, we could certainly at the next meeting do more comparisons as to what the previous assumptions were, or as I always do, we will compare what is in each of these assumptions versus what is in those assumptions at the time come December. We could do a walk down the timeline of all of those if need be.
That's okay. I just,
Okay.
my sense was that it was really close to the control, but
I think I agree.
I think
I think
you're
it's just
saying
slightly
it's a
more negative than that.
Slightly more pessimistic than the control. But,
I believe so.
Okay.
Excellent.
Greg, did you look like you wanted to say something?
Well, I would just comment that when we get to the revenue stuff, when we do the control optimistic pessimistic blend sheet, the approximate amount of the revision in the control forecast, for instance, is about $305 million downward revision, and at the time for 26, it was control was a number, pessimistic was like minus 300, optimistic was like plus 300 around the control. So from a revenue standpoint, it's not a perfect correlation between the economy and revenues, as you well know, and we'll talk about. But there was about a $600 million gap between between pessimistic and optimistic, and today's control estimate would call for a $300 million downward revision.
And let me just say, I was answering towards the S&P Global. I think Greg, of course, has the more important point because that is the final result, would be the numbers. But I was
All the
answering
information was wonderful. Thank you. Good job.
All right. So again, as we can see, the difference between the optimistic and the control is quite limited, but you can see that larger gap. And of course, we've also prepared our traditional bar charts where we compare the control, the optimistic to pessimistic. And here you see the numbers that I've mentioned repeatedly as I laid out the difference. I normally will not go through each one of these, but for real GDP. So there we have that 1.8% growth in the fiscal 26 as compared to the 2.6% growth versus 0.8% growth in the pessimistic scenario, optimistic scenario spread. And we see that trend continue. And then we see a little bit more of a confluence of everything coming together for fiscal 28. And that gap gets smaller, 1.5% in the control forecast, 1.7% in the optimistic, and that 1% being held constant for as we transition from 27 to 28 in the pessimistic forecast. And so we will use these graphs as we always have in the past. Now, employment, obviously, now here's where we get a strongly different picture. And again, this was prepared before the downward revisions and the benchmarking with the BLS data. But you can clearly see, again, a very small gap between optimistic and control, with pessimistic being quite pessimistic. And to put it there, you can see only in the pessimistic scenario do we have negative growth in the next 2 out years, the 27 and 28 fiscal years respectively, but very limited growth on the positive side in fiscal 28 Obviously, anytime you see us have to move to an extra decimal place, that means obviously there was quite a small gap that was going to be identified. Now, it's definitely a more interesting story when it comes to manufacturing. You know, it is very rare that we see a manufacturing forecast where we have the optimistic being below the control. But remember, in the optimistic scenario, we wrap up the trade war. Things aren't as bad. So the control represents, for lack of a better term, a little bit more autarky. You know, we're talking about a little bit more manufacturing home base, but I will tell you they are quite pessimistic overall in terms of manufacturing employment in the S&P Global Forecast. So we, of course, are very concerned about this, given in the Commonwealth, the fact that we have all three major car manufacturers, and we, of course, do have a significant manufacturing base. If we look at the percentages here, there's an awful lot of negative numbers. So declines in all three forecasts for fiscal 26, continued declines in fiscal 27 with a strong increase in the amount of the decline in the pessimistic forecast. We eke out a small increase, but again, we have a decline in optimistic, which is unusual, but again, I think this is trade related. And of course, this is the entire nation that is being forecast, not Kentucky specific. We are in a slightly more interesting position given the number of times that car parts and the components of car parts can travel across the border back and forth. And we've already seen several of the car manufacturers talk about what little of the cost of tariffs have been internally retained and therefore lost by the companies and what they plan to do going forward. But I believe all forecasts here do assume that firms will not be willing to contain and internally eat the cost of the tariffs the way they have been. So that is certainly expected to lead to a reduction in overall manufacturing output in the near term. Personal income, we've had moderate personal income growth. We saw quite a bit, of course, coming out of the COVID pandemic emergency, but we've seen that moderating. And you can see here in the comparison charts, again, strong growth in that optimistic, 3.9% in fiscal 27, but not too bad considering where we've been to have the control forecast have a slight dip of 1.7, increasing to 3.2 in fiscal 27 and then moderating to 2.8, but with relatively flat growth in the pessimistic forecast. Wage and salary disbursements, similar story, of course, to personal income, but an even tighter band. In fact, almost to the point where you would need to zoom in to see the difference. And you can see that here on the chart. Again, 4.87 versus 4.88% growth in fiscal 26. Essentially, there is no difference between the control and the optimistic forecast for wage and salary distributions. It does get a little more interesting, of course, in the out years, where we see essentially flat growth across all scenarios of approximately 4.6 to 4.8% growth in the control, but we see relatively strong growth, 4.9 to 5.4% in the optimistic scenario, and relatively slow declines of 4.6 to 3.5 to 3.4 in the pessimistic scenario. Now, consumer spending, this is excluding food and energy. We can see, again, not as much of a spread, but certainly a downturn. And we can see that in the pessimistic scenario, and you'll certainly see it here in the bar charts. Relatively below trend growth in the control with a 1.5 going to 2.5. Fairly strong growth in the optimistic, but very low to declining growth in the pessimistic scenario as we fall from 0.6 to 0.5 and then eke out a 1.6% increase in fiscal 28. Housing starts, as we know, there's been a lot of pressure for the longest time. All we heard was we need more housing, need more housing. And yet housing starts are at the lowest point in the last 5 years. And partially, we know that that is going to be exacerbated by the actions being taken on the deportations and, of course, the tariffs. Obviously, a lot of the inputs, wood coming from Canada, copper, there's a lot of products that go into a house that are facing tariff pressures. And so we can see that housing starts, especially in the pessimistic scenario, we are talking about significant declines. It's expected to decline 3.4% in the control, but 8.2% in a continued decline of 7.1 and 1.4 in the pessimistic scenario. In the control scenario, we go from that negative 3.4 to a very slight positive, 0.2 to 0.4%. The sale price of existing homes, there has been some recent selling pressure. I believe that vast majority of metro areas, if you look at the Case-Shiller Index, are about 20% above inventory overall. So there has been more homes brought to market, but obviously We've talked about this numerous times, the number of individuals who obtained mortgages right after the COVID emergency, people who've locked in, I'll just make up a number, an average of about 3.25% mortgages, are loath to give up that mortgage and loath to move on to another house. So the median sales price, we have seen those pressures. We've seen in the forecast, you can see that in the control, growth slowly ramps up, 1.6, 2.2, 3.3. In the pessimistic scenario, we hold solid at 1% and then slight uptick in 1.9%, but the optimistic would have some fairly significant growth, 2.3 to 2.6 to 4.6. But still, compared to what we observed in fiscal 25, relatively little activity in the overall housing sector. I added this slide in at Greg's request. I think this is an interesting slide, especially because these are the typical items that people go out and buy when they purchase a home as they form new households. It's also a category of product that is deeply impacted by tariffs. A lot of furniture and durable household equipment, if it is made here, of course, we have the impact of aluminum and steel tariffs on the input prices. And then, of course, if it's imported, we have the impact of the tariffs directly on those products. And you can see, again, that relatively flat line, the very low to slow growth in the pessimistic, and with a little bit more positivity in the optimistic scenario, again, associated with increased home construction and household formations. And you can see that here on the chart. The difference between where they believe we are headed for fiscal 26 is quite stark when you look at 27 and 28 in the pessimistic versus the control and the optimistic forecast. Our consumption of gasoline and oil chart, again, we talked a little bit earlier, I did, about the impact of oil prices. Oil prices tend to be what drives drill counts, and we've seen a lot of movement away from oil drilling in the United States and more towards natural gas. Natural gas prices have increased, and we have seen relatively stable fuel prices. And you can see here on unit sales of light vehicles, a major component of the Kentucky economy, of course, being the production of new light vehicles, a stark difference between what would be expected. That vertical gap between if you take from the optimistic all the way down to the pessimistic, that is a significant number of vehicles that would not be produced. And of course, that's an annual rate of production. And you can see that here on the chart. The control forecast, 6.9% decline versus a nearly 11.5% decline in the pessimistic forecast. And then as you see as we go out, the control forecast would have growth occurring in fiscal 27 versus continued declines in fiscal 27 for the pessimistic forecast, and then all three forecasts have a slight uptick. Although again, let's always think about growth rates. You're coming off of a very low base in the pessimistic forecast. So that 3.4%, while yes, that's percentage-wise more growth, you would not be at the production level that you would be assuming for overall light vehicle production and sales in the control scenario. It's just growth off of a lower number. Again, real exports of goods and services, almost no difference between the optimistic and control, but again, a fairly decent gap in the pessimistic forecast. Again, relative importance to Kentucky, of course, is the export of motor vehicles and parts, and again, a strong difference between the pessimistic scenario and the almost identical control and optimistic scenarios. I also added this in at Greg's request, the University of Michigan Sentiment Survey, and you can see that this forecast has a stark difference, a continuing decline, a malaise, if you will, between the what is assumed in the pessimistic forecast in the near term versus what is assumed in the control and the optimistic. And this one we did include the bar chart because it's very important to see how strong of a decline we are talking about in the assumptions. A minus 3.1% decrease in the overall consumer sentiment survey in the control versus an 18.4% decline. And the sentiment survey is based on essentially a 100-point margin. To put this in perspective, we are talking about an assumption of essentially a 52 versus a 52 versus a 42 in the overall consumer sentiment assumed in 26. everyone has a slight recovery, and then because you're coming up off such a low base number, it makes it look like the pessimistic forecast has wildly positive growth, but it's still not to the level the control would be. It's just you're coming off such a low number. So while the word recession is not reused, I would say, if you all remember the days of the 70s, the phrase stagflation could be a more appropriate sense of what they believe consumers are going to be feeling in the pessimistic scenario in fiscal 26. Lack of growth, an increase in prices, but not necessarily a technical recession. This, I only included the column chart because the lines are essentially on top of one another. There is not a tremendous difference in the consumer price index, although I will say an interesting component, we mentioned AI data centers earlier. The increase in electricity components has been absolutely shocking. I obviously wish Dr. Sinclair was here because I'm sure he would have a lot more information. But just on the numbers in the BLS survey, a 35% increase in the cost of a megawatt hour in the last 4 years. That is a very strong increase. And we know that, of course, AI data centers aren't paying the residential rate, but electricity is electricity, and we would expect there to be some increase in prices at the wholesale level and at the industrial scale if we are seeing those kinds of prices. Obviously, the BLS only includes consumer prices. That was the number I was basing those remarks on. The core price index, which of course excludes food and energy, which everyone always makes the joke, well, why do you exclude? Those are the two that continuously go up and down so much. But if you look at those two, you can see, again, there's no line chart here because in terms of the overall trend, you wouldn't see a lot on the lines. But in the column charts, you can see the difference here. Now, notice again, I had to go 2 places past the decimal to compare the control to the pessimistic in fiscal 27. But I assure you, none of us are going to feel a difference between 2.46 and 2.45% in the average long-term effect, but it was obviously they were not the same size, so I wanted to be specific about what each of those are. But you can see the consumer price index falls more in the pessimistic scenario. Again, that's not necessarily because times are getting better, it's also because when people are under financial distress, they buy less, and we'd expect the consumer price index to fall. So. Retail sales, including food service, another popular variable that Greg likes to use for sales tax. You can again see that relative trend versus relatively stronger growth versus flatter growth in the optimistic and pessimistic scenarios. Specifically here, again, the column chart makes more of a statement on it. 3.7%, essentially exactly the same growth we observed for fiscal 25 and 26 going into 26 for the control forecast versus a 3% to 1% to 1.5% growth rates in the pessimistic, as opposed to the 3.7, 3.1, 2.9%. So just an ever so slightly step down in the control forecast versus some fairly positive growth. Obviously, 5% growth in the optimistic scenario would be fairly strong increases in retail sales. Again, as we just saw the last estimate on GDP, the investment in AI contributed more to GDP growth than consumer purchases. Also, a new slide that we added in, since again, why are we here? We're here to talk about state and local government funds, and so looking at the forecast at the national level for state and local government personal tax receipts, you can see again, relatively consistent growth in the control forecast, a slowdown to a slight increase in the pessimistic, and of course, fairly strong growth in the optimistic forecast. Statistically, you can see again that pessimistic forecast 3.3 down to 1.1% growth, back up to 4.4, versus a relatively consistent, let's call it an average of 5% growth over each of the years in the control versus fairly strong growth, 5.4 to 7.4 to 7.9% increase in the optimistic scenario. So that was an awful lot, but I know there may be questions, and of course, let's be honest, a tremendous amount has occurred. So of course, we can hold off on the Kentucky economic outlook if you wish, if you all have discussions amongst yourself about the national economy, or I'm happy to move forward on Kentucky, and you can talk about all of it yes.
Ask one quick question. You've already told us that this data that we'll be using from S&P Global is a month and a half behind or so.
Correct.
For in our December meeting, how many more reports from S&P Global will we get? In other words, like how many times will the data be revised before we meet when we meet in December?
There would be 3. So
Okay.
because we The September is being prepared and coming out now. October, of course, we released, and we'll be using November. Now, when we meet in December, we will not be using the December forecast, but the December forecast will be published.
Yes.
But we would not
three
have
more
time.
times.
Yes, but we
Okay.
would not have time to use the December forecast to prepare. I don't believe. If
That's okay. But we will get 3 more updates.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks.
You're very welcome. All right. All right. So switching to Kentucky, obviously, as we know, a lot of our the MAC model takes what has been presented in the S&P, mixes it with the Kentucky specific data, and we have our forecast. So starting with Kentucky non-farm employment. Again, not surprising, given what we have seen at the national level, we would be expecting some continued slow growth in the control forecast, almost no difference in the optimistic, but with concerning decline in the pessimistic forecast. Specifically, you can see the 0.6%, 0.5, 0.2, so very, very slow growth in the control forecast, as opposed to the 0.2 declining 0.5 and then repeating declining 0.5% in the pessimistic forecast. And of course, the optimistic forecast still declining, but of course at higher rates, 0.9, 0.7, down to 0.2. I apologize, I should have moved the decimal place on those last 2 columns to point out the specific difference between the control and the optimistic. And we always add in, how do we compare to what is being assumed for the U.S. economy as a whole? And you can see in this case, in the control forecast, we are expecting slower growth than the nation as a whole every year of the forecast period. The 26, 27, 28, the trend does not change throughout. Now, unfortunately, if you thought the employment forecast was not as rosy as you might have hoped, the manufacturing employment forecast, especially in the pessimistic forecast, is quite concerning. Now, we, of course, know that given our manufacturing base, especially for light vehicles, automobiles, and of course, other important components, jet engine parts, all the glass, all the aluminum production, all the things that we do in Kentucky, no surprise, we are looking at some potentially bigger impacts in terms of the overall numbers here. So again, the control negative of 0.4 to 0.5, slight improvement to 0.4% in the control forecast, and then in the negative 1.1, 2.1%, and 0.8% in the pessimistic forecast. So manufacturing employment, however, here we flip the script. We're expected to do slightly better overall than the nation as a whole. So ever so slight decline compared to the nation as a whole for fiscal 25, which is essentially in the books, versus a 0.4%, 0.5%, 0.4% decline versus, again, 1.5, 1.3, and an ever so slight increase in fiscal 28 for the nation as a whole. Kentucky personal income, again, very little difference in the line chart. Let me just jump to the column chart, and you can see here relatively modest increase coming off of the 4.4% growth of fiscal 25, 4.6 to 4.7, slight decline to 4.1% growth in fiscal 28. That's opposed to a continual declining growth rate in the pessimistic forecast, 4.3, 3.7 down to 3.3. And again, the optimistic forecast is quite positive, 5%, rising to 5.4% before moderating back to 4.8% in fiscal 28. Again, we trail behind the U.S. as a whole in what is assumed in the control forecast for personal income growth. Every year you can see that we are behind what is assumed to happen at the national level for personal income. Kentucky wages and salaries, much like personal income, almost no difference between the optimistic and the control forecast. However, we do see a moderating growth rate in the pessimistic forecast, and you can see here that pessimistic forecast, that would be 4.2 to 3.1 to 2.1 versus a relatively constant, although slightly declining growth rate in the control, 4.3 going to 3.8 in the out year. Wages and salaries, you can see again we're expected to trail the U.S. as a whole. Now, this is interesting, transfer payments. As you're aware, one of the major items that will be coming into play late in the forecast period is the change in Medicaid, the requirements for community engagement, reassessments. There's also other changes to the SNAP program. However, those changes to the program would be beginning in the beginning of fiscal 28. So halfway through the calendar year 27, we would expect that. So you have a slightly unusual case here where I believe the transfer payments forecast, while they don't go into a lot of depth, you can see that in the out year, the actual forecast is expected to go up. And this is just a transformation of a variable in Global Insight. I'm sorry, S&P Global. And I believe what is going on here is the fact that they assume that either there's a moderation of the impact, people are more prepared, and so that we don't see possibly as large of a hit to these different social support systems that are going to be impacted by the passage of the Tax Reconciliation Act. But we do know that in Kentucky, of course, we do have a significant portion of our population that is receiving Medicaid benefits. And I believe that is what is occurring in this forecast. I don't know that this will hold when we are back here in December, that the optimistic would have a higher growth rate in the out year than either the control or the pessimistic. But that is my assumption. But I did want to point that out because I realize it is a strange anomaly to see more transfer payments in an optimistic forecast. Well, now that I've plowed through, I will certainly be happy to answer any questions. Correct. Yes, you're correct. I mean, as I alluded to what we just observed and what was presented in each of the quarter estimates of GDP, to have such large movements, to have things such as retail purchases, to have the consumer spending have less of an impact than what we're seeing from the construction of data centers. But again, we have an awful lot of, just sticking with the data centers, we have a lot of contracts being talked about. But as we know, people can forecast a lot of activity and things don't come to fruition. You know, we can see that the pressures that are being placed on the electrical grid, and again, I wish Dr. Sinclair was here to talk about this a little bit more, we know that prices are a good way to allocate things. And we would expect that as prices increase, we're going to see more and more allocation, and we're going to start to see, you know, more and more people make choices that might cause some of these assumptions, which can be extreme in either direction, not come to pass. But as we sit here today, this is the forecast that S&P Global has presented and that we have incorporated in our estimates. So you are absolutely correct. I guarantee that we will see some significant movements in what is being used when we come back in December. Yes, sir.
I had a question. Maybe we'll get into this when we start talking about the actual revenue forecast. But I know S&P Global is incorporating tariffs, so you went over that. But does the Kentucky MAC model, either previously or what you've done for us today, do they include any kind of specific impacts on tariffs that might affect Kentucky more than the United States, like light vehicles, agriculture? So just my basic question is, you presented numbers for the Kentucky MAC model. Is there some kind of specific adjustment for current tariff policies that have only been in effect a few months?
I'll let Greg address that. I have my own thoughts, but I will let Greg address that question.
Unfortunately, no. We don't have that level of specificity in the MAC model.
Right. And I think I know where your question is headed. You know, well, obviously, based on the econometrics that are used, we don't have, this is an entirely new regime, if you will, of tariffs. We haven't seen this level of tariff impact so broadly impacted, so we don't know if the response rates will be similar to what has been observed in the past because we're outside of what we have observed in the past. But I think we will have a little bit better idea when we're back here in December as to what levels of these assumptions are being moderated and which ones are being expanded. If there's no additional questions, I appreciate your time.
We typically revisit the economy after the revenue forecasts are presented, so if Michael will be back for that. If you have specific questions about the economy after we do the revenue forecast.
Sure. And the MSA. Let's not forget the MSA. No. Thank you.
Gene, can I take this one? Too quick. Can you click on all revenue? The all revenue slides. Hit F5, please. I've already talked about the mission that we're after. In terms of the rest of the bullets on this introductory slide, suffice it to say, in the introductory slides, I'm just going to go over what has happened since you've been here last. I don't need to go through all the bullets, but I do want to go through some of the major occurrences in the revenue world since you've been here last. The pleasant part of the story is fiscal 24 in the general fund. You may recall that we met in December of 23. At the time, we had November receipts, but we didn't have December. So for fiscal 24, we were estimating 7 months. Actually more, because we didn't have the second quarter, so we were estimating 3 quarters of fiscal 24. And if you'll look to the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see that we came within $16.8 million with a forecasting error of 0.1. So you guys really nailed fiscal 24, which is usually a great portent for how you're going to do. If you get the base right, you're going to do better in 25 and 26. Well, yeah, I mean this is a great testament to consensus forecasting. We flat out nailed it. You can look at the components, but they're all small errors. So I was very happy about that. The road fund was not much different. We came within $7.1 million on a $1.8 billion fund, and you'll notice that of the 7.1, 7.3 of it was in a minor tax and motor vehicle license tax, and that was in the truck proportional registration, which is a IRP tax, and it comes in very lumpy, and we caught a lump at the bad time, and we're short $7.3 million. But on the major 2 taxes, which are over 80% of the road fund, you can see we were less than $1 million net off, which is, again, the story should end right here, because the general fund and the road fund really pounded it in fiscal 24. Now, in fiscal 25, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, which is where I want to start, $131.3 million difference between the estimate and a 0.8% error, forecasting error. If I wanted to give you the rainbow stew version, I would stop right there. because that's pretty good estimating. Within 1% on the second year, 131.3 million. That's good aggregate forecasting. The problem is that the top three lines, individual income tax, sales tax, and corporate and LLET, and you can see that individual and sales are starting to trend down from the forecast. In fairness to the forecast, individual fell 8.4%, which is the largest decline in individual income tax in 10 years. Sales tax grew only 0.3%, which is pretty rare growth on the, as I'll go through on the sales tax slides. That's fairly rare on the low side. So we did overestimate the individual in sales. It was offset by a $506.7 million difference in the major business taxes. And I might as well tackle that right now. We got some non-recurring declaration payments, in particular in the month of July, October, and January. That I say non-recurring because we don't think those declaration payments are going to be made in fiscal 26. The July, the small number of businesses that we're talking about in July contributed over $200 million to declaration payments, and we didn't get that in July this year, which I'll talk about shortly. So we think there's about $400 million of non-recurring money in the corporate account. So you can see the 506 over. We think 400 of that, or a little bit more maybe, is non-recurring. So that's part of the reason that the budget director called for revision of 26, because the biggest two taxes are kind of trending the wrong way, and we had some non-recurring money in corporate. So that was the story on fiscal 25. I do wish we could concentrate on the lower right-hand corner, but the story's up a little higher.
Greg, can I ask a question? And my understanding is that individuals who were affected by flooding are being allowed to file their taxes as late as this November. So this would be 2024 annual taxes, but that counts in fiscal 25, right? In some level. And the two questions I have is, like, do we have a sense of how many people have not filed yet for their 2024, and whether they're likely to get refunds, which is going to make that individual income tax even worse, or whether they're likely to owe taxes, in which case we're going to close that gap? Or is this just a small number that we don't care about?
Well, we do care about it. We think that
We care about the people.
certainly, and do we know how many people didn't file? No. Do we know if they're refund or pay returns? No. But we did build in approximately $50 million into the forecast as a money that didn't come in fiscal 24 that will come in. I'm sorry, that didn't come in fiscal 25 that will come in fiscal 26. So we estimated $50 million. But it's very difficult to tease out from the data we get from revenue how many returns and whether they're pay or refund returns. You would think if you're getting a refund, you wouldn't delay. You wouldn't wait till November. That's why we put a positive sign before the 50, because logic would say that if you're getting a refund, you'd want it quicker. So we estimated 50 to the good. Okay, road fund actuals versus estimates in fiscal 25. Pretty good estimating, 2.1% difference, 38.5% or $38.5 million forecasting error on, again, a $1.86 billion base, which is pretty good in the second year. You can see that fuels underperformed and usage overperformed. The $719.5 million that we received in fuels was an all-time record for, I'm sorry, not fuels, usage. The $719.5 we got in usage was an all-time record, and so that kind of offsetting error helped a lot in terms of the nominal error. So not too bad on the aggregate numbers in fiscal 25, but there's some stories there that are worth noting. This is just a slide that has annual general fund revenue growth since fiscal 10. The main thing I wanted to point out when I first did the slide was we've had 15 consecutive years of positive growth in the general fund, which is noteworthy. And the other thing that I think is telling, the 10.9 and the 14.6 obviously led to billion-dollar budget surpluses those 2 years. But we also had billion-dollar budget surpluses in 23 and 24 because the budget estimates were done in 22, and the 14.6 got up there, and growth off the 14.6 was still nominally way over the estimates for 23 and 24. So we actually had a $1.42 billion budget surplus in fiscal 24. So when I talk about investment incomes, those 4 years generated significant budget surpluses that mostly got deposited into the rainy day fund and generated the investment income that I'm going to talk about. I showed some quarterly growth. I don't have much to say about it. I had a story. In fiscal 24, we had in the third quarter, remember, we had a individual income tax decrease, of course, from 4.5% to 4%. And so I expected that third quarter to be less than 3.5% growth, and it grew 3.5%. So I was sweating that we were going to be a little bit on the high side, and then in the fourth quarter behaved as we predicted, 0, or I expected a little bit negative, but we got 0, so we came in really close on 24. But I did not expect that 3.5% in the quarter following a tax decrease, a half-point tax decrease in the individual income tax. What else happened since you've been here? Well, we had 2 legislative sessions. And legislative sessions always bring changes. It goes on behind the scenes, and you don't all see it. But when you look at the official estimates that we present at the CFG meetings, and if you brought your book from last time, you're like, wait a minute, that's not what we agreed to last time. It's different. Well, after every session, the statute says the estimates by the CFG will be the official estimates unless modified by acts of the General Assembly. Well, these are the acts of the General Assembly. And so you at the end of every session, we redo an official estimate. We call it an enacted estimate or an official estimate. Statute calls it an official estimate. And so these are some of the things that were put in the General Assembly's regular session of 2024. I'm not going to go through each line because there's some rabbit holes that are easy to go down if you get into the details of most of these taxes. But I will say in your packet, there's two very informative documents that were prepared by the staff of the LRC's appropriations and revenue staff. They after sessions they do a presentation to A&R, and they present all the actions of the General Assembly from each session. So the 2024 version and the 2025 version are in your packets, and if you desire to read the details about any of these things, I would refer to those, and if you have further questions, you're free to contact me or whatever. The 25 ones, these are what ended up on the score sheet, the official score sheet. There were obviously more actions of the General Assembly. The money, the big money was in House Bill 1 when we did another rate reduction. The rate reduction conditions hit in, I guess it would be fiscal 24, which allowed, which led to House Bill 1 in the 2025 session, which you need the rate reduction conditions to hit, and then you need an act by the General Assembly for the half-point reduction to kick in. So this half-point reduction lowers the individual income tax rate from 4 to 3.5 effective 1/1/26. So, and the reason the score is, you think that's a big score, it's only half a year. So 359 million is the effect that the 1/1/26 rate reduction has in January through June of 26. Of course, you'll get another roughly 359 in the months of July through December. So that was the biggest action, House Bill 1. And this is a chart that I thought I'd put in just as a reminder to everybody, what the rate's been doing since we enacted these rate reduction conditions. First it went from 5 to 4.5, and then the very next year it went from 4.5 to 4. Then we didn't hit the rate reduction conditions, so it stayed at 4. And then what I just described in House Bill 1 brought it down to 3.5. The 2020, the 1/1/2027 is colored pink, and you may wonder why it's colored pink instead of blue. And that's because General Assembly meets in 2026, and they can, the rate reduction conditions weren't met, so it's not like a foregone conclusion that the rate will go down. In fact, they haven't met the rate reduction conditions, but it's pink because the General Assembly's in session. They can change the rate outside of the framework of the rate reduction conditions, but they weren't triggered, so it's likely going to be 3.5 and 127 unless the General Assembly acts. Rounding up my introductory slides, I do want to mention we've had a lot of legislative changes, and I wanted to just have a little not geek talk, but a little discussion about how we address tax law changes when we forecast revenues. There's at least two different ways that you can do this. One is you can create a policy neutral dependent variable, which is theoretically preferred, I think. What you do is you have a let's call it the individual income tax, because we do a policy neutral dependent variable for the individual income tax. What you do is you take the history and you adjust it such that it's rate neutral. The rate goes down, so you would essentially be adding back money to your dependent variable such that you have a policy neutral dependent variable, and then you get a forecast off that policy neutral variable, and then you would take out the money that you put in. So that's kind of one method of doing it. And I'll talk about the pros and cons of each method in just one moment. The other method is to do kind of what I do in the sales tax, honestly, and that is after a period of time has elapsed, you just forecast the nominal revenues and assume that the tax law changes have been built into the base, baked into the cake, if you will. And here I'm thinking about the sales tax on services. We imposed the sales tax on services in the 18 session, and we added some more in, I think, 2020 or 2022. I think it's 22. We added some services to the base. Well, I could have created a policy neutral series like we do in the individual income tax and added them back and did a policy neutral forecast that way. I chose not to because, well, let's get into the drawbacks and strengths. The policy neutral dependent variable, the hard part is you have to know the fiscal impacts historically and prospectively. And fiscal impacts are unobservable. When you lower the tax from 5 to 4.5, 4.5 to 4, it's unobservable. You don't know after the fact what that cost you. You see what happened to receipts, but you know when you change the rate, it affects withholding, it affects the pass-through entity tax, it affects your declaration payments, even affects net returns. So it's there's a lot of information that needs to be known for the policy neutral dependent variable thing to work, but it is, like I said, theoretically preferred because normally when you do a regression analysis, I used to call it in graduate school the ceteris paribus pound. There's certain things that are in the dog pound of ceteris paribus that you have to assume when you do an analysis. And one of them in tax forecasting is that the tax policy was the same throughout the forecasting period. And the policy neutral series does try to get there. And I think it allows the forecaster to calibrate the effects of policy changes more precisely. The only flaw in this law is that you have to know the fiscal impacts historically and prospectively. The other method, assuming the tax law changes are built into the base, it doesn't require the fiscal impacts to be known precisely. it protects the forecaster from large errors in estimating the fiscal impacts. And I know that on the sales tax on services, we missed some of the services, the ones that we could follow, and we missed them by a fair bit. And so when you just forecast the nominal series, that kind of goes away. But it's theoretically not as preferred because you're not holding it, tax policy the same. But at some point, it's built into the base, and I go ahead and forecast that way. So those are the two methods. They mainly apply to the individual and sales tax. Okay, my final introductory slide is to talk about what happened in July and August. July it declined 12.7%, but in our circles, we still called that a pretty good month because the sales tax grew 2.5%. Individual really grew 14%. Withholding was up 7.7%. The major business taxes fell 80.5% because of the non-recurring money that we got in July of fiscal 25, which is July 2024, which is in fiscal 25. So as I mentioned earlier, we think that was non-recurring, and July was a partial demonstration that maybe it wasn't recurring. In the month of August, we also had a good month. Sales tax grew 5.8%, which is in the old days when we were growing 10+% a month. That would be nothing, but 5.8 in today's world is pretty good growth in the sales tax. Year-to-date growth 4.1%. Again, pretty good year-to-date growth. The individual income tax has really had a good start to the fiscal year. It grew 13% year-to-date, up 13.5. Withholding had a great month, 17.6% growth. Year-to-date, 12.6. We do think that there was some that withholding was slightly overstated due to some timing issues where some receipts posted to August that were that probably should have posted in a prior period. So 17.6 was a little bit affected by some money that wasn't really August money, but got posted in August. But still, no, that's small potatoes compared to the 17.6% growth. We had a great month in withholding. The major business taxes increased 27.4 million, down of course 73.1 for the year. But I just wanted to show that major business taxes are still growing. You know, we had 27.4% or $27.4 million in growth in the major business taxes. But that account is going to lag because of the non-recurring money that we've already talked about. Year-to-date, general funds down 3.7%. But the two largest taxes, sales and individual, showed positive growth in July and August, and we're happy about that. So that's what's happened since you've been here in December. And if you have questions, I'll take them. Otherwise, we're going to go through the taxes one by one like we typically do. Seeing none, I'm going to yield to Dr. Thomas Jones to talk about the individual income tax.
Will that thing reach here?
Yeah.
Here we go. Good morning. So first I want to go over a little bit of recent. Can y'all hear me? I want to go over briefly some of the recent history in the individual income tax accounts. The PTE started in the fourth quarter of fiscal 23, and you see there that it really jumped up in fiscal 24. In fiscal 24, if you recall, the legislature allowed taxpayers, this is a voluntary tax, so it allowed taxpayers to go back and file for tax year 22, tax year 23, and the current year of fiscal 24. So in fiscal 24, there were many filers who were filing taxes on tax years 22, 23, and 24 at the same time. That's why that number is so large there. The monthly and quarterly payments, can y'all hear me? Is it everyone can hear me okay? Okay, good. The monthly and quarterly payments are very messy for the first 3 years of that tax. Tax year 22 PTE payments, the end dates of when you were allowed to voluntarily make the payments for these arrears tax years, the end dates were very strange. So you were allowed to do the PTE for tax year 22 up until August 31st of 2024. And you were allowed to pay the PTE for tax year 23 only until April 15th of 2024. So you've got this sort of strange end dates. And I think the reason for that is that 22 was already in the books a long time ago, and for you to make an amended return would require the taxpayer to have to go back and get some old documentation. So they gave them a little bit longer timeline before they could set the deadline for that. I think that's the reasoning why they did it that way. But needless to say that it flipped over into fiscal 25. So people were making tax year 22 payments in fiscal year 25. That's the important thing that's going on here. And a lot of people did that. They delayed up until the August 31st deadline. And so we've got a lot of messiness in the first 3 years of that tax. Yesterday was the due date for the September payment. The payments are very similar to the individual income tax declarations payments, except for there's not a January payment, there's a December payment. Net returns has been very noisy with the tax rate changes, tax mod, and stimulus effects. Withholding dropped sharply in the first 2 quarters of fiscal 25. It fell just 1.8% in the third quarter and then rose 4.9% in the fourth quarter of 25. Declarations fell 23.6% in fiscal 25. This is the third double-digit decrease for declarations. So declarations has been sort of trending downwards. Fiduciary has had a negative balance for the last 3 years, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to the fiduciary forecast. The far right column is the growth rates for the whole individual income tax account. Last year, individual income tax fell 8.4%. That's a $488 million decline. 281 million of that was PTE, 189 million of that was withholding, and 106 million of that was in declarations. Net returns and fiduciary both had small increases compared to fiscal 24. So the general methodology that I use for withholding, as Greg stated, I generate a policy neutral series. I take out all of tax mod, or I should say I plus it back in to create a policy neutral series. Then I run my regression analysis, and I do my forecast, and then I subtract the tax mod back to the predicted values. This is I think I'm going to be stuck with this methodology for a while because, and the reasoning is not so much that it's built into the cake or not built into the cake. The reason is because the adjustments are so large. We're in the billions of dollars. We're over $1 billion in adjustments every single year. And so it's important that I keep those fairly well-known adjustments manageable. The methodology for the PTE, that's a pencil number, but it accounts for many different variables, including the fact that we are taxpayers are no longer paying in the tax year 22, 23, or 24. They're only paying current declarations on the current tax year. The declarations methodology is a simple ARIMA forecast, but it does include 10% of the tax mod adjustments. Net returns is a simple MA3 model, which I've been using for quite a long time now. And fiduciary, was using an MA3 model for a long time, but the fiscal year 24 receipts included a whole bunch of refunds that were from tax periods prior to fiscal 24, and therefore they were not representative of real fiscal 24 payments. So I removed them entirely because I didn't know how much was real and how much was a refund. So I removed all of fiscal 24 entirely and just did an MA2 based on the remaining observations. Oops. So here's the Kentucky wages and salary variable that goes into the withholding model. And I wanted to give you an idea of what the growth rates are for the regression model. And you can see that they're all pretty solid, and they're all fairly close together across the three scenarios. And here is the withholding forecast after I get to click a button. This was several weeks of research of work that little click takes care of, but this is the final forecast after accounting for all of these things. The difference between pessimistic and optimistic is surprisingly small. And if you looked at the difference between the three scenarios in the Kentucky wages and salary, that's where all of the variation comes from, is that model. So the difference in what the MAC model and what S&P Global say about the variance between those three scenarios is the reason why the difference between the withholding forecast is so narrow as well. The difference between pessimistic and optimistic is just $9.5 million. For FY27, the difference is $37.5 million, and for 28, it's just $86.1 million, and that's extremely small. This is largely because of S&P Global, and the band of in their model, and that feeds into the Kentucky wages and salary, which is our Kentucky MAC model. So I want to talk a little bit about focus on the control scenario, the FY26, the minus 0.2% growth rate. That should stick out a little bit on the page, but I want to explain why that is what it is. So here I've broken down the 4 observations of FY26 so you can see exactly what's going on in the final model. This is the post model after all the adjustments have been taken into account. So the first half of FY26, we've got solid growth rates, and that's largely because of the Kentucky wages and salary solid growth rates. Then we impose on that the change in the tax mod from the 4% marginal tax rate world to the 3.5% marginal tax rate world. And that's what's going on in the second half of fiscal 26. That's January 1 of 26. For the PTE, as I said, this is a penciled in number, but it takes into account the tax rate changes and the loss of the tax year 22, 23, and 24. And now going forward, we're only talking about just the current tax year declaration payments being made. And so that's why I've got it fixed for all 3 years. I've made no assumptions about marginal tax rates changing in the future. While Greg said a moment ago about what we assume about FY26, the 3.5%, even if the legislature in January were to change the tax rate, we as a policy, we don't make changes based on what we think the legislature is going to do. We base our estimates and our tax mod numbers based on what we know right now, and therefore it's constant going forward. This is an ARIMA model, and it performs just like any ARIMA model you've ever run. It completes any type of demand shock, and then it steadies out and becomes a very fixed trend line. And that's exactly what this declarations forecast does. There's not much to explain. It's just under $360 million for each of the 3 fiscal years going forward. Net returns has a lot of variation in it because this is an MA3 model, and the history has been very volatile. And so when you run an MA3 on volatile history, you get a volatile forecast. And so I do still think that this is this is a well-behaved series, and I do believe that we're going to be in the negative 100 million, negative 60 to negative 100 million dollar range for net returns going forward. We've seen a lot of regime changes in net returns in the last decade. It used to be pretty reliable to put negative 130 or negative 200 million in net returns and call it a day. But we saw over positive $100 million just 5 years ago in net returns. So there's been lots of regime changes in how net returns has been behaving. And I think now we're back in a new regime where we're going to be in the negative $100 million range. So this model sort of hones in on that a little bit. So the fiduciary, like as I said, I eliminated all of the fiscal 24 observations and just ran an MA2 model. And I wanted to talk a little bit. I think I've mentioned this before about how fiduciary can be negative, but I wanted to address it again because this bothers me. I don't know if it bothers anybody else, but it bothers me. Normally, in a normal year, and to go back to what normal is, you have to go back before 23. A normal fiduciary year had all negative months except for 2, and that was October and April. And usually in April is when you got this large set of payments that offset all of the negatives for the year. But what's happened recently is they've been, since PTE has occurred, they've been putting all of the money into the net returns account and balancing it out at the end of the year. And so instead of the negatives, instead of a large positive number at the end of the year in April, we were getting a much smaller number, a much smaller positive number in April, like a $2 million number. So we're building up this set of negatives into the negative $10 million area. And then in April, we would get a negative $2 million, or a positive $2 million in April. And that would not fully offset the full set of negatives for the whole fiscal year. And that's what's been going on for the last 4 years. So to account for that, the forecast going forward assumes that the same thing that's happened for the last 3 years is going to happen for the next 3 years as well. So here's the sum of all 5 accounts for individual. Negative 1.4%, 2.4%, and 3.0%. Are there any questions about individual, sir? I know it's a lot. Sir? Yes.
Sorry. You're right. It is a lot, but we're being asked to do fiscal year 26.
Yes.
And so our fiscal year 25, we were off by about 227 million. So can you give us like a 3, not even 3 second, but anyway, just a short, like why you think we were off for 227 for fiscal year 25, because that might mean that we might be off again for fiscal year 26, which we're being asked to redo. Is there something that stands out in your head about, did we pick the wrong estimate? I think that was a question earlier, whether it was control or pessimistic, or did the model not perform as we thought it was going to, or you're not sure?
I think the majority of the story is the PTE. It's the largest unknown. We have very little history to go on, and how I expected the PTE to be utilized by the taxpayer has not really. It's not what the taxpayer has done, and what I thought the taxpayer was going to do have not been the same thing. And a lot of the credits are still outstanding, and they did not get taken. And so it's hard to explain why, if you've got $1 million in PTE credits due to you, why you didn't take them last year. I can't explain it, but that's really what's been going on. We know for a fact that they've got the PTE credits available because they paid the tax. So that amount of PTE credits is due to them, but they did not take the credits, and I can't explain why. But they're still due to them, and so it has to come in a future date. That's the only explanation that I can give, but I can't explain why.
Sales tax, sir? Just going to start with a history of sales tax growth. as I mentioned earlier, 0.3 in the most recent completed year. You can see that that's below most averages that you can compute with this data series. I liken it to, this may be a bad analogy, but when you're a little kid, your shoe size grows from 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 real quick, and that's what happened in the 12, 11, and 10 growth years. We were growing fast. And then eventually, when your mom buys you a pair of 9s, it takes you a while to grow into them. 4.1% growth off of those 3 big years was still good growth. That was still good growth in terms of the nominal values. The values had been pushed up so high that growth off those high values was still tough to come by. And I think the 0.3 is further testament that, hey, I'm not, my shoes aren't growing as fast anymore because we're at high levels now. So anyway, bad analogy, but that's what the sales tax growth looks like. As I've already alluded to, we did overestimate the sales tax at the December 2023 meeting. 24 I was happy with. The actuals only had a small difference from official estimates. We've already talked about that. Fiscal 25, the actual receipts produced a larger difference, in particular $258.8 million. And Dr. Bartley, I'll tell you why shortly. The fiscal 26 is what we're being asked to officially revise today. When we met in December of 23, the blended model that we selected was calling for 3.8% growth in the sales tax for fiscal 26. Just by way of comparison, today's control estimate predicts 2.6%. So we were over projected, and the current estimates are lower than the estimates we were calling for in December. And it's slower than official predicted growth in all 3 scenarios. And that's coming off a reduced base of overestimation in 24 and 25. So there'll be a sales tax is going to be one that needs further revision in 26. Let me take a stab at saying why the sales tax started veering off course. Again, it was on course in 24, but when we met in December of 23, I remember it very, very clearly. Time series models were in favor. You may recall that I do blending. I blend time series models and structural models. Time series models were in favor because if we'd used time series models in the previous forecast, we would have been much closer to forecasting those big jumps that we had in the sales tax. We did blend. We didn't take all time series, but in hindsight, just as a matter of fact, the structural models would have produced more accurate estimates than the time series models. So I was mindful of that in the blending process this time. It could be a reverse. It could be a reverse. It could be the time series models in this biennium forecast better. But that's my analysis of why we veered off course, is that the influence of the time series models was pushing the estimates a little bit higher. In terms of what we do in the sales tax, the the sample that I use is 2010 quarter one through 2025 quarter two. These are calendar quarters I'm talking about. We have data back to 1990, but I've tried starting the forecast at various times. I think 1990's not worth doing. I started it in 2020, or I'm sorry, just the year 2000. Excuse me. Gosh, 2000. I found that to not produce as good estimates as when I started it in 2010. So my sample is 2010 to 2025. The last historical quarter was the fourth quarter of fiscal 24, even though we do have 2 months in the bank. And a lot of times, if I have 2 months in the bank, I'll do some sort of short-term analysis to figure out what September is going to be and add that as a historical quarter. But due to the timing of production of material like this, I didn't have August receipts just came out on September 11th, and we didn't have time to process those. So there's no data from the first quarter of the fiscal year. All the models use seasonally adjusted data. I do an ARIMA, a VAR, and a structure model. The ARIMA is not your dad's ARIMA. It's got a longer. I know it's ridiculous to try 16 lags and a diagnosis for an ARIMA model. I do. The 16th moving average term would not go away. What you do is you take all the variables that are possibilities that fall to standard deviations outside of the parallelogram, and you take them out in terms of the least significant, and 16 just hung around, and that's why and it ended up being significant in the end. So it's a AR13 with first differences and MA1 and 16. And it just so happens that when you use a moving average of that length, it gives you more variability. It does, like Thomas was saying, if you use like a ARIMA 111 or something, or a 211, it does. You're forecasting with forecasted data after two observations, whereas if you use a longer term, you're not forecasting with forecasting data till period 17. I do run a VAR. The dependent variables in the VAR are sales and Kentucky wages and salaries. You may note that Kentucky wages and salaries don't have a lot of variability between scenarios. That was one that kind of when Michael Jones was going through the economic slides, it kind of the line graphs were on top of each other, but in VARs you're talking about the lags. So I still found several cross terms that produce lag values that helped on the sales tax equation. And you get a freebie on the VAR. You get a Kentucky wages and salaries forecast, which I found lined up really well with the MAC model. So that gave me some confidence that maybe I was on the right track. The nominal retail sales was exogenous. So having an exogenous variable in your VAR does give you the ability to run a control optimistic pessimistic, because you can put that in your VAR and have the variation and control optimistic pessimistic. Nominal retail sales did have a little more variation than some of the other variables, so that helped. The structural models, I ran two that worked really well. I did cut it back to one instead of blended structural models. Thomas is wearing me down on that in terms of using model diagnostic tools to pick the best model instead of blending 4 or 5 different structural models like I did in the past. So some of the variables I used are nominal retail sales, inflation, and then inflation less food and energy. I don't use both of those in the model that won out. I'm just saying those are the two variables that I tested in the models. I use a variable that Michael plotted, state and local personal taxes. For whatever reason, that does really well on structural models for the sales tax. It makes sense. It's a national variable, so it's not a state variable, but it does come in strong. And then I use Kentucky personal income. Again, doesn't have a lot of variability between scenarios, so you're not going to get a big spread on that one. But personal income work better than wages and salaries in a structural model. And here's what they look like. The ARIMA model, before, like last December, the time series models were the highest models. The VAR and the ARIMA were the highest forecasted models. This time, since the sales taxes leveled off, so have the VAR and the ARIMA have leveled off because they're feeding a little bit off most recent history. In the blending process this time, the more VAR and the more ARIMA you choose, the lower your estimate's going to be. And the structural model came out the highest consistently. So let me make a few notes on the control optimistic, pessimistic scenarios and how we blended the three models. When the exogenous variables that we used were plotted earlier, there were tight bands between the control optimistic, pessimistic scenarios. So I didn't get when you think about it, you can miss sales and use tax by $50-100 million in a month, and not be surprised. So it is a little bit disconcerting to me that these models produce such a tight band over a fiscal year. But I was true to the econometrics, and I did not use post-model add factors to adjust the scenarios to be more reflective of what I think a best and worst outcome could be. When you think about all the uncertainty in the economy with tariffs and just everything, there's a lot of uncertainty out there. I resisted the temptation to do add factors. I didn't do them. I say time series models are somewhat incapable of producing COP. ARIMA models are. There is no control optimistic pessimistic for an ARIMA. It is what it is. For the VAR, there is a control optimistic pessimistic, but it's just that one exogenous variable that gives you the difference between the models. So what I did, in full hand on the Bible, the control forecast, I just used uniform weights. I used 1/3 of the the structural model, 1/3 of the ARIMA model, and 1/3 of the vector autoregression. The pessimistic, you may recall that I just said that the time series models were lower than the structural model, and the lowest was the ARIMA. So for the pessimistic, I double weighted the ARIMA. So I did 50% ARIMA and then 25% VAR and structural. And for the optimistic, structural model was the highest, so I double weighted the structural models and used 50% structural models, 25% of the other two. And that was one way I was able to build a little bit more variability between. If I just used the scenarios, there wasn't going to be much separation. So I was trying to build a little separation to account for the fact that there is so much uncertainty in the economy.
Greg, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I like blending, and so my understanding, I guess, from, and you just cleared it up, is that you're assigning weights to the blends rather than using some other quantitative method to kind of figure out how econometrically it might be optimal to blend. Is there a reason that you assign the weights, or do you go through a process of thinking about?
You didn't say scientific, but I use the word scientific because I don't remember the word you used. The proper way to blend is to do in-sample forecasting, withhold data from the model, forecast using your forecasted values, and get you and do a restricted least squares regression, restricting your coefficients to be 1, and use those weights. I did that. The result I didn't bring with me, but they did favor the time series models. The structural model fared the poorest. It had the lowest coefficient. I think it was like 0.26, and the ARIMA model and the VAR models had roughly the same coefficients, and they made up the other 74%. But the proper way, you're right, there is a proper way to do it, and the proper way is restricted least squares.
But if that, I mean, that's about a third too, right? I mean,
Yeah.
26. So it's not, your control is not too far off from what econometrically you would estimate.
Yes, sir. And I withheld 8 periods, so you really don't have a lot of degrees of freedom in those restricted least squares equations. So I don't know how much to trust them. You can withhold more data, but then because you're chewing up degrees of freedom because you have three variables to account for.
Greg, can I ask another question?
Yeah.
So you're using the series. You're using that whole series we're seeing there in your estimates. When you estimate your ARIMA model or your VAR model in particular, your structural model too, what time periods are you using as data?
2010 through 2025 quarter 2.
Okay.
Now this plot, I only went back to 2018 to
No, that's fine. Yeah. It's nearly impossible to predict turns in economic series, as we all kind of know. There is an obvious turn here. Like sales tax revenues have been, for the first time, certainly in your graph, and as far back as I can remember, have not grown the last year and a half. Do we know why? Because that's not going to, your ARIMA model is not going to fit that. Not well. Because it's too few observations and it's at the end of the series. So, but that seems really important to me given our miss in 2025. I mean, because clearly we missed that flat, which forecasting's hard. Do we know why it's flat? Can we ex post explain it?
And well, I always talk to the Department of Revenue to see if there's something I'm missing in the data. I look at the data, but then I get stories from the Department of Revenue about anything that's going on that may have affected collections or is there any pattern of refunds that I'm missing or something like that? And the story I get is kind of why I told that shoe story was we grew so fast so quickly that further growth off of those high levels is difficult, and the Department of Revenue said, well, another thing that we discussed with them was, a lot of the inflation is occurring in non-sales taxable items, groceries, gasoline, there's a lot of non-taxable items where a lot of services have gone up dramatically. Non-tax services, I mean. The best I can come up with is that the inflation is not occurring in sales taxable items as much as it is non-sales taxable items, which lowers your disposable income, etc. Not very satisfying answer, I know. But good, because that was strained. That was strained for sure. Here's what the scenarios look like. It's kind of a traditional what you would expect. I'm not real happy with the symmetry between the pessimistic and the optimistic. I expected the control to be closer to the pessimistic than the optimistic, but that is how it came out, and those are the scenarios that we can address when we get to the blending sheet at the end. And here are the numbers. Again, you're being asked to officially revise 26, and on the sales tax, optimistic to pessimistic is only $50 million, which is the way the model came out. $50 million with as much uncertainty as we have seems like not a big enough gap between the scenarios, but that's where the econometrics led me. So, and when you get to fiscal 28, because we do have to do the preliminary estimates, the gap does grow to 350 million or something, which is a little bit more of a choice for you all to make. But in fiscal 26, not a big gap between the scenarios. And that concludes sales tax, and I'll take further questions on the sales tax or yield to Gene Zapranic-Brown.
I have one more question, and it's just so I'm jumping ahead. Sorry. I'm looking at the first page of the general fund, and there's a estimate for fiscal year 26 for, in particular, everything but sales and use is what I'm looking at. Where does that estimate come from? Is that coming from the control? That's coming from the control, right?
What sheet are you looking at, sir?
Fiscal year 26. On page 84, sorry. That's coming from the control. And that's coming from the new control.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And our official was 6299, right? What we came up with last time was 6299. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
And then the difference I'm calling for is
Yeah.
328.2 million.
If you were to choose the control today.
And the yeah, okay, great, thanks.
Move on.
I think I will exercise my enormous power as chair of this august body and declare a 10-minute recess.
You realize we have 85 slides left?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're 2 hours in, we have 85 slides left.
Although we did start 5 minutes late.
We did start by minutes.
That was 2 hours.
Yes.
Wow. Good job, guys. Where's the nearest restroom? I'll show you.
With his shoe analogy, I tried to talk about how he liked zips as a kid. I'm sure he had zips.
Made me run faster.
Yeah, they did.
Confident.
The shoes I had 61 first cousins, and all the mothers, all my aunts and uncles would come and dump the shoes on the table from the older kids.
You knew there was one.
And you would just pluck out, you know, you'd go in and draft the shoes you wanted to.
Present on the mind and as well as the presentation.
Sometimes even.
Nobody put in.
That's right.
They
No,
did on
no,
socks.
no boots and sandals.
Drop the microphone.
All right, let's continue with the major business tax forecast.
Good morning. I'm going to talk about the major business tax forecast. Is it this? Whoops. Just next. Greg covered the actual versus the estimated in the last 2 years, so I'm not going to, there's nothing more to add to that. I'll move on. Here's a history of the major business tax collections. And of course, the major business taxes are the corporation income tax and the LLET tax combined. At one time, those were forecasted separately. We combined them. A, there's a lot less volatility when we combine them, and B, there was the Department of Revenue would do journal vouchers to try and get the money in the correct basket. They stopped doing that, and it just gives us a better forecasting series if we combine them. You can see from fiscal 11 through fiscal 19, no big spikes, a little bit of growth. Of course, there was the fiscal 20, the pandemic decline. There were significant increases in 22, 23, and 24. However, there were several factors that explain that. The economy was strong, corporate profits were increasing, the bank franchise tax was repealed so that the financial institutions were included in the corporation income tax. We estimated that would be approximately a $60 million increase in the tax. And also in 2018, 2019, there were a number of tax law changes that affected the corporation income tax, including changes to the tax rates, the apportionment of income, tax credits, our net operating losses, the deduction were handled. And while those were scored as a negative or a decline in the taxes, Greg pointed out, we don't actually see that, and it's possible that those declines that we booked were actually not quite as large as they were. And then we have the 25, the incredibly large increase. It was nearly $600 million increase, or a 47% increase over the fiscal 24. Greg talked about the one-time money that was in there, which begs the question is, how are we going to forecast this going forward? We need to make an adjustment to that 25 number, or otherwise we're going to have another extremely large forecast. We don't have the exact number. We don't know the exact amount of that one-time money. We looked at estimates for the U.S. corporate profits tax forecast during that period. It was approximately about 10%. So the decision was made. I decided we would assume that the growth for 25 was 10% and lop off the difference of the 1834 that we collected, and then forecast using that amount for fiscal 25. This is the forecast that I use. You can see that the pessimistic is fairly flat. There was also a decline in the level of the corporate profits. The optimistic forecast shows fairly strong growth in 26 and leveling out in 27 and 28. The control has growth again in 26, not as strong, and leveling out in 27 and 28. In terms of a bar chart, you can see that the growth rates under the control put us a little bit more in line with what we've seen in the last 3 years, well, excluding the 25 number, with not a lot of difference in the 26 between the optimistic and the pessimistic, and slightly bigger differences in the out years, but not significantly different. In terms of growth rates, you can see that they all drop in 26, 22 to 25%, with a little bit of growth in 27 and 28, although the pessimistic does have another decline for fiscal 27.
question. Both of you talked about it, so I don't want to go into spend a lot more time on this. But again, that miss was big, and so I just want to make sure about. I mean, luckily it was big, and we collected a lot more. But I thought you said you don't know where it came from, but
We don't know the exact amount.
okay. So how do we know that it's a one time, and why did we not know? Maybe because we met 2 or 3 years ago. Why did we not know that that one time was likely to come in, and then? But we're pretty sure now that that one time won't come back. I guess that's my big.
Well, we don't know. We certainly didn't know why it came in. It came in declaration payments. There was a large declaration. The declarations were quite large in July last year. We haven't seen that occur yet this year. We're looking through the first 2 months. The major business taxes are down 73%. So the assumption is, and in discussions with revenue, that this will be that was non-recurring money. I can continue with the property tax if that's. We talked a little bit about or you saw a little bit about the property tax estimates. We were within $400,000 in fiscal '24. The motor vehicle had the largest difference of $13.5 million. And so we had some overestimates and some underestimates, and they ended up averaging out. The real property, we underestimated it. They came in at $9.4 million more than expected. That's because the real property ended up growing at 6.6% in fiscal '24. That there are items in place that typically restrict the growth, and the rate is adjusted to take care of that in the following year. I can talk about that when we get to the real forecast. And in fiscal '25, again, it was very close. We had offsetting errors. So the total difference in the property tax was $2.1 million in fiscal '25, or 0.3%. So looking at the property tax history on the total receipts, a lot of the property tax graphs will look like this, slow, steady growth. And that's, these are based on the value, the stock value of whether it's property or vehicles, so that we don't get a lot of variation in that. That tends to be fairly stable. But it has had some increase in the growth rates in the last couple of years. Looking at the real property tax, looks very similar with growth over the last several years. Some notes on the rate setting process for the real property. So the rate is set for statewide revenue growth to be limited to 4% annually. If the assessment of real property is more than 4%, the tax rate is lowered. Now, it's important to keep in mind that when the rate is set, the new property and the tax increment finance projects are excluded from the calculation, but they're subject to tax. And then the next point is if the actual growth, like last year, exceeds 4%, it was 6.6%, there's an adjustment in the rate calculation process to take care of that excess revenue, so the rate is lowered. So the 2025 rate now is 10.6 cents per $100 of assessed value. Quick graph of the property tax rate over time. It was 31.5 cents in 1979 when House Bill 44 came in. You can see it was gradually lowering. It lowered until we got to 2008. It got to 12.2 cents. It stayed there until 2020. So that was the first time the rate had ever stayed steady, and then it has continually dropped again over the last couple of years. So you can see the percent change in the real property tax assessments. Early in the graph, 6-7% was standard. Beginning in 2009, we had through 2020, we were below the 4%, so that rate stayed fixed. And now real property tax rate, again, over the last 5 years has increased. We're looking at 6 and 7% increases in those assessments. So this is the assessed value of the new property and the TIF projects that are excluded when the rate is set, but they're taxed. So I think what happened is you can see that that number has grown from $4 billion in 2014 to over $12 billion in 2025. Primarily, that's TIF projects. In 2025, we had almost 25 TIF projects in there. And so what happened, I think, is to get the 6.6% growth last year in real property, that amount of the TIF money is pulled out, but then when it's taxed, the receipts are higher than 4%. So the forecast for the real property is in the red bars. That's 3.5% a year. That's kind of the long-term average. And you may wonder why we don't forecast at 4% when the rate is set to produce 4% statewide revenue. That's a gross number. You have to take into account cost of collection fees for the sheriffs. You have to take into account the 2% discount on early payments in the first 30 days. You have to take into account non-payment of the bill. So there are any number of things that would lower that. And so the forecast going forward for the real property is 3.5%. Here's the tangible property. There are a number of components to this. The rates range from 1.5 cents per $100 to assessed value to 45 cents. This piece that we're looking at here, that's tangible property, it has tangible, think of like manufacturing machinery and that type of thing. It has telecom property, it has watercraft, and it has apportioned vehicles. There's a little bit of bumpiness in there. That has to do, well, the increase over the last couple of years is primarily due to the uptick in the assessed value of the tangible property. It's about $10 to $12 million higher than it was in 2024. So it went from like it ranged from 96 to $108 million. That's the largest portion of this component of the tax. The telecom property is $15 to $17 million, and that's been steady the last several years. Same with watercraft, that's about $4 million. And then the apportioned vehicle is increased a little bit. That ranges from $6 to $10 million. So the main driver of this is the tangible piece. And so we have the forecast increasing slightly over the forecast period. The motor vehicle, other than the 2020 dip, has been fairly constant, and we have the growth in that. At the end, I have growth rates on these, so just kind of continuing on with trend on the motor vehicle property tax piece. Omitted and delinquent, it does bounce around quite a bit. You can see some spikes in 13 and 14. That's when revenue had an amnesty program. The delinquent portion is very steady. It is usually between $6 to $7 million annually. The omitted can change quite a bit. That is property that wasn't listed on the books, but once it's identified and we've collected, the revenue is collected from them, and it's on the books, that number tends to drop down. So you can kind of see, you'll see the omitted property it can get high, and then when it drops down, then it gradually builds back up and drops back down. So that's the piece that has a little volatility to it. The 18 and $19.5 million forecast on this is basically the longer run average on this is what we do with this. This is the public service company. Tax, the history and the forecast, again, they all look pretty similar, some steady growth. These are your utilities, your co-ops, your railroads. They do have tangible property, the biggest component of the forecast. This is centrally assessed by the revenue cabinet, is the franchise value. But we see a little bit of continued and steady growth in this. The other tax, there are 4 fairly small components: the bank deposits, distilled spirits, which is the largest of this, $4.8 million at $3.7 million. It has building and loan and domestic life insurance. So these other ones are really very small. And so we just have a little bit of growth over last year, staying flat. This is what you look at when you combine all of the pieces together with the forecast. Steady growth. This is what kind of you see over the long term on the property tax. And so now we can see the pieces with percentages. So the total for this year, it was 3.9 last year percent, this year 3.5%, 3.2% in 27, and 3% in 28. Happy to answer any questions. I know that was quick.
All right, thank you very much. The big stampers will buy them in bunches. Is there a limit to the downward trend? It doesn't appear. If there is, it hasn't shown up. The rate of decline is increasing, and the forecast does not call for improvement in that account. In fact, well, it does call for a little improvement. The rate of growth is negative 8.1, negative 8.6, and negative 8.7. I don't have much more to say about it except for it's just hard to get the growth rate low enough. You know, the average tax for all states is up to $2.03. I believe it's over $2, and at some point, the only chance we have to steady demand is to export cigarettes to other states, but because our rate's $1.10 and the average rate is over $2, but not a growth area, and it won't be a growth area.
Greg, I
Is it-
should probably know this, but do we tax vaping?
Yes, we do.
Is that in here?
It's in the other taxes. When we get to other
Okay.
taxes, it's lumped in with what we call other tobacco products.
Thanks.
We tax open vaping and closed vaping. Most of the money's in closed vaping. I got some slides on Kentucky Lottery. I'm going to go through them rather quickly. We broke the $2 billion sales mark in the lottery, which is nothing. I remember when we broke $1 billion, that was a big deal, and it hasn't been that long ago. So we had nominal growth of 58.4 million last year, which is 2.8% sales growth. The problem with the translation from sales growth to dividend growth is the mix of our sales. The more profitable games are not growing, and the ones with the higher prize payouts are growing. Yeah, we're getting pretty good growth in sales, but it's challenging dividends because, for instance, draw games, Mega Millions, Powerball, Pick 3, Pick 4, they were down 15.1% last year, and those are the games that are lucrative in terms of dividends. Scratch-offs are lucrative. They were down 2.8%. The game that's rising is iLottery, the instant play lottery, internet lottery, close to 800 million last year, and we're calling for continued growth in over the biennium. But again, these have highest prize expense of any product. This is a graph of past dividends, and I've got the projection for 2026. We don't do an optimistic control and pessimistic for lottery. It's just an estimate. Like I said, scratch off is flattening. This is the most recent trend in scratch off sales. Kind of peaked in the COVID period and hasn't had any growth really since then. Draw games have fluctuated, and they're jackpot determinant. When it got up to, what was it, $2 billion? Recently, it got up really high, and it grows like 400 million towards the end because everybody's out there buying tickets, and those are you can make up a lot of ground when you get those big jackpots. In terms of, we were running behind going into that period of the Powerball jumping up so much, and that did a lot to catch us up. So again, draw games are very jackpot dependent, the big ones. iLottery instant play, the growth has been phenomenal. Since 2018, when it was fledgling, we're up to close to $900 million worth of instant play sales. Again, the prize payout is high, but it is the primary source of growth in lottery sales. it's been common practice in recent budgets to put limits on the lottery dividend that goes as part of the appropriation to Kia. For 26, the budget language says if lottery receipts, excluding unclaimed prize money, exceeds 370 million in fiscal 26, then all of the excess shall be transferred to the trust and agency account. And the very next slide shows a history of language like that and how much was diverted from just a general fund receipt to the agency and trust account. The red bars in the middle are the amounts that were transferred. Last year we collected 371.0 million, but due to the language, we were capped at 350.7. So 20.3 million was directed to be put in the agency and trust account. The estimate going forward is we'll work on that before December a little bit and see if that Powerball run up made enough of a difference to change the estimate. But we've sort of given the fact that our three biggest profitable games have flattened or gone negative, and the only growth really is iLottery. I'm in contact with the Lottery Corporation, and we thought it prudent to do 370 for the current year forecast and level it off in the out year forecast, and we will of course revisit that before December. But that's where we stand right now. There's just so many other challenges and opportunities for gaming, with sports wagering and historical horse racing, and just the gaming dollars being in high demand from a lot of different gamers. So it's hard to post consistent growth in the lottery. We have for years and years and years due to innovation and stuff, but the challenges have mounted. That's the lottery. I'm going to go through some of the other taxes, miscellaneous other taxes. You'll probably note that we didn't do a coal presentation after individual. We always used to do coal, and the recent declines in coal severance tax. If you add up all the extraction taxes, the mineral severance, natural gas, oil production, and coal severance, I call them extraction taxes. It's hard to say. Extraction taxes in the other category, but I've got a slide that has the largest accounts in the other. The largest account didn't used to be anything really, but due to those budget surpluses I talked about earlier, income on investments is now the largest in the other revenues category. In fiscal 25, it grew to $323 million, 7.6% growth. That's by far the largest other revenue source. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Insurance premiums is the second largest, and that's been growing very fast. I talked to the Department of Insurance at pretty great length. due to some of the natural disasters and flooding and tornadoes and you name it, hail damage they gave me a statistic that for every $100 in premiums, that they paid out $167 in claims. So there's a little bit of catch up in the premium setting, and of course the insurance premiums is a tax on the gross value of premiums. So we're going to see growth in insurance premiums taxes here. The growers and other taxes are the insurance the ones that will continue to grow are the insurance premiums taxes and the parimutuel tax. The parimutuel tax has gone up because of the proliferation of historical horse racing. That there's an end to that curve. There's only so many of those that have been permitted, but parimutuel tax is really shot off, and that's a high growth area, and so is insurance premiums. Some of the other taxes are flat or declining. Investment on income has been a growth category, but I've forecasted that to go down, which I'll talk about very soon. The other taxes exceeded the estimate by $50.8 million in 24 and $123.7 million in 25. Those are big errors on a $1 billion set of collections, and the errors can be explained essentially in two taxes or two revenue sources: income on investments. The official estimate in fiscal 24 was 289.1. We brought in 300.2, which is only 11.1 of the, what did we say? We were over 50.8. But it was a source of part of the reason we were overestimate, but fiscal 25 is where it really made a difference. The official estimate, we called for a drop. We thought the investable balances was going to drop a little bit more sharply than it did. The official estimate was 219, and we brought in 323. Which is 104 million over forecast. So we missed the other forecast by 123.7, and 104 of that was investment income. The other revenue source that outperformed was insurance premiums taxes. We collected 221.2 in 24 and 239 in 25, which is hefty growth. The forecasted amounts are on this slide, so the actual revenues over forecast were 25.6 in fiscal 24 and 37.8 in fiscal 25. So between insurance premiums taxes and investment income, that explains why the other tax forecast was off. Since the biggest error was in the forecast for investments, I want to talk just a little bit about it. Before 23, it was obviously not a significant source of revenue, and then the budget surpluses came. The fund is invested in a short-term pool that had previously benefited greatly from the rise in short rates. So the fund grew pretty rapidly. So you can see it went from nothing in fiscal 22 to 150 to 300 to 323. I talked with the Office of Financial Management to get the forecast. We try to forecast. Essentially, it's just a function of two parts. investable balances and interest rates. Just like any asset, you need to know what your investable balances are and the rate that you expect on those balances. And we're going to do a lot more work on this before December, I promise. We're going to have a tighter model that goes monthly. We had that last December, a monthly model that allowed us to tweak it a little bit more. But the control forecast for income and investments for this meeting is 260, 240, and 220, which is a combination of lower rates and lower investable balances. This is the S&P Global forecast for T-bills. I'm not saying that the money's invested in T-bills, but it's invested in short-term things, and this was a proxy for what short rates are going to do, according to S&P Global. I'm now going to turn to extraction taxes. In particular, I think Thomas is just going to talk about the coal. So Thomas, take it away.
Okay, just briefly on coal. This is the exact same model specification that we used in the last CFG. This is a simple demand model, own price, price of substitute goods. Oops, I'm sorry. Thank you. This is the own price, price of substitute goods, and an income variable, simple demand model. Same as I used, the exact same specification as last time. Next slide, Greg. Can you push that, click it for me? And here's the forecast. Prices last September were, spot market prices for Central Appalachian coal was $82.15. They fell slightly up until April of this year, and they bottomed out at $78. Then they slowly rose up until July to $79, and now they've fallen back down to $78. So we're currently about $4 a ton lower than last year at this time. So prices in general are falling slightly right now. Severed tons are also falling. In fiscal 25, we severed 22.8 million tons of coal. That's the record. My data goes back to 1981. I have been collecting data for a very long time. This is the lowest amount of severed tons we've ever had, 22.8 million tons. So both P and Q are both contributing to the downward, to the decrease in coal severed tons, in the severed tons tax. But mostly it's mostly Q. Next.
Yeah, it's just a matter of time before the minerals taxes comes a little bit closer to coal. We have a extraction tax on minerals, which is mainly limestone, and it brings in about $26 million a year. So coal's creeping down towards the mineral severance tax area. So, you know, the extraction taxes includes 4 different taxes. It includes a natural gas severance tax, which Thomas forecast for me, oil production tax, which Thomas forecast for me, and the mineral severance, which Thomas also forecast. He forecast all the extraction taxes. And that's why this slide has, it usually just says other receipts forecast, but now it says control, because Thomas does do a COP on all the extraction taxes. So now other does have some variance between control optimistic and pessimistic. And I did since there's a great deal of volatility in investment income, there is a control optimistic pessimistic for the investment income as well. So you can see that we're not forecasting much growth in other taxes. As I said, there's some increasing accounts, but there's also some accounts that are struggling. And the drop from 1238.6 to 1219.9 from fiscal 25 to fiscal 26 is solely explainable by the drop in insurance or income on investments. We're rounding up the general fund here. I just have a few remarks. Here are the percentage growth of all the scenarios. You can see in fiscal 26, what we're putting in front of you is a gap between negative 2.7 and negative 1.8. So we're predicting a decline in revenues from fiscal 26 to fiscal 25. I was bragging earlier that we had 15 years of consecutive increases in the general fund. In all three scenarios, we're calling for a decline in fiscal 26. Fiscal 27, the gap increases for the preliminary estimates that you have to render. The gap gives you a little bit more choice between high and low, and it actually closes up a little bit in 28 due to some of the patterns that we've shown you today. So I did a little quick math. These are the estimates that are going to show up in the spreadsheets that I put up. At the bottom is a little bar chart that shows you've got a $136.2 million decision in 26, a $416 million decision in 27, and a $615 million decision in 28 for your preliminary estimates. But I just wanted to give you some context for how big a gap there is between scenarios. The taxes with alternative scenarios, just to keep this straight, individual income tax, the withholding component has a control optimistic pessimistic. The sales and use tax, as I described, has control optimistic pessimistic. Major business taxes, by virtue of the difference in the corporate profits forecast, has a COP, and the other taxes, by virtue of the extraction taxes and the income on investments, has an alternative scenario. None of the remaining revenue sources have any variation between control optimistic pessimistic, but you're catching individual sales and major business taxes, which is in other, which is probably 85% of the general fund. So that has a control optimistic pessimistic option. So typically what we do before we go into the road fund is flash up a spreadsheet that a blend spreadsheet, and then you all talk about how you want to blend, which usually brings in a further discussion of the economy. Gene, could you hit the escape button, please? Is that the general fund one?
Yeah.
What's that say?
Cannot save auto recover info. Network connection or change location. Is it open down
We don't
there?
need to save.
What is it?
Or in the center, is that it open? What's that? It's okay. Yeah. there
Can
we
you
go.
do it, please?
There you go.
This needs to be.
That's my friend.
Is that readable to you all?
Enlarge it to 100%. If it'll still fit on the sheet.
Right now, what's shown is 100% control, but we can certainly, on the fly, change it to whatever whatever blend you'd like to see. Again, as a reminder, the changes we make to fiscal 26 are official changes, and the 27 are your preliminary estimates by statute that need to be agreed upon by consensus. So Thomas is going to reach over here and see if he can.
But did you say we're going to redo the fiscal year 26 in December again as well, or this is just a one-time redo on?
The December estimates call for official numbers for fiscal 26, 27, and 28. So, yes, whatever you decide today will be superseded by what you decide in December. For 26. Yes, sir.
Craig, can you remind me? I know one of the things that was sent, receipts for July and August are down what % compared to last year? I apologize. I read that stuff, but then my mind.
Year-to-date, general fund receipts have declined 3.7%. So that's through July and August.
Fiscal year to date, July and August.
Yeah.
And that is not in any of our, in any of the models.
Correct.
Right? That means that compared to what we collected in July and August last year,
Yeah.
it's down 3.7% this year. Okay.
And the major taxes are actually doing fairly well. It's just that non-recurring money in corporate that and major business taxes that is the primary reason we're down 3.7%. Yeah, so is August. I'm going to scroll down, not to be distracting, but the control estimate, the 305.2 at the bottom shows the difference from the current official estimates. So you can see the parts that are going up and the parts that are going down. If you were to accept the control, the individual income tax would represent a $136.2 million reduction to that estimate. Sales and use is the most egregious, $328.2 million reduction to the official estimate. The other tax would be $109.6 increase to the official estimate, nets out to $305.2. So that's how you read that bottom panel. And of course, that will change if you want to pepper in some pessimistic or optimistic. We can plug that in. Gene, do you mind? So when you plug in 90-10, your gap is now through.
Go back up. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I don't know if this sheet shows the difference. I mean, I even put in like 50% pessimistic, 50% control, and I think it's like 40 million difference in 26, 127, and 150 in. So I mean, yeah, I mean, I think to your point, if you add any pessimistic, it drops it a little bit. But even if you do 50, Talking about like 100 or 150. Yes, as opposed to the control, 100%, right.
We can bring Michael Jones back up here if you have any lingering questions about the economy that you want to ask. The I guess the bottom line is the reason the bands are so tight is that the exogenous variables that are in our models are not exogenous variables that have big, gaps between control optimistic, pessimistic. I mean, we use Kentucky wages and salaries, and that's got a very narrow band. A lot of the, and that's your withholding forecast. So that's, the reason the individual income tax doesn't have much variation is because it's a function of the regressors that we chose. So. The tightness of the band is a direct result of the choice of variables that were good fits for the revenue models.
I'm usually the pessimistic one, or one of the pessimistic ones. I guess I think of somewhat of a blending because even on the control, I mean, I know we'll get 3 more S&P Global things between now and December, but I mean, they're listing unemployment for the next 3 years, 26, 27, 28 is like 4.5%. I mean, that doesn't seem like very.
That seems pretty optimistic to me.
I guess that's my point. Pretty optimistic that we're not going to 5% of unemployment during that time. I mean, that's even the pessimistic is not an outright recession. It's just a little bit lower. So generally, I would say to maybe make a compilation of them, but I'm up for suggestions.
There's another thing to consider, and that is, and I don't know in Kentucky how these numbers are holding up, but nationally, one of the reasons the unemployment rate has remained fairly steady is that the labor force has contracted quite a bit, and particularly in states where there's a lot of agriculture. I was out in Owensboro a few weeks ago, and on the way drove through lots of soybean fields, and I know soybean is not a huge cash crop. It's big for the farmers who do it. But what's happening to those soybeans now? They're not being sold because China's not buying any American soybeans, and there are other agricultural products similarly. But it's not just the ag workers; it's the people in the processing facilities aren't showing up to work, and so and I don't know what the numbers are in Kentucky, so. I'm not sure if we just go under the normal assumptions and tweak whether we're capturing all of that, and so the unknowns are harder to figure out this time, at least for me.
Just as a reminder, and I'm not recommending anything, but when we met in December of 2023, the mix that we settled on was the mix of the recommendations from S&P Global. I think it was what was it?
Punted
50, 35, 15 or something like that. We use the mix that S&P Global chose. I'm not saying that's appropriate this time. I'm just reminding you of what you did last time.
I don't think it's appropriate. I'm gonna point something out. We have 2 months of data on current revenues. It shows a 3.7% decline. The most pessimistic that we have is a 2.7% decline. If I was going to make a guess, if I have to pick between the three choices that you've given me, which I know I don't, but if I had to pick between the three choices given me, I would pick the pessimistic because it's the closest to the real data that we currently have. I also get to completely change my mind again in 3 months. So
But one of the reasons we're so far down is that unexplained the bump, right? And so if you take that out, but that was a one-time unexpected up, and now it's a one-time unexpected down, right? It was the big slug of money that came in that we're not expecting to
yeah, but
repeat.
the change in growth is relative to that, right? So it's still a 3.7% decline.
Right.
And so unless you think all the other funds are really going to outgrow that decline, right? So you would have to be super optimistic about individual income and sales and use tax growth. And I mean, even the most pessimistic has sales and use tax growing 2.1%. So you have to be pretty optimistic about the economy growing.
So the 3.7 is below what actual, right? So actual to actual,
Right.
right? And so this is measuring estimate to estimate, right? So that 2.7 is estimate.
No, that's actual to estimate.
Well, we can't have an actual 26, right? So that negative 2.3 up there, the general fund, that is a relation to
25. That's the growth relative to 25. We're currently growing at negative 3.7 relative to 25. So, I mean, I'm happy to go with the control if you want to, but I've got 2 data points. They say negative 3.7. I'll be optimistic and say, no, it's only going to be negative 2.7.
I should have maybe said earlier when we talk about the corporation income tax and that money, we say we're down 73% year to date. That doesn't really mean anything. I should have given you dollar amounts. So last year, in the first 2 months, in the major business taxes, we collected $260 million. This year, we've collected $70 million. So the vast majority of that, we think maybe is $400 million, is basically already occurred. So the next 10 months, you'll have another 200 million. So it's going to be, it should inch up potentially.
So we felt all it down right now. We expect that down.
A lot of it, not all of it. Yeah.
Of the 400 million that we think is our estimate of non-recurring, 225 of that was in July. And the rest of it was in October and July, were the unexpected declaration months.
David Sinclair sent me an email yesterday with his take. Sorry he can't be here. Yeah, he is for the general fund forecast, and he has a somewhat extensive explanation. But where he comes down is he supports using either the 100% control or a 50-50 blend of control and optimistic.
And optimistic?
Yeah. Pessimistic too.
I'm a little more optimistic than the group, but my question, when I'm looking at the data, I'm seeing that they're predicting the inflation rate to be pretty much the same as it is right now, and the unemployment rate to be pretty much the same as it is right now. And there is some positive economic growth, which makes me wonder, how much of it, well, now we need to get, what gives us that big pessimistic forecast? So I wonder about that. But also, I'm wondering, in December, will we have additional data points that will reflect how Kentucky is impacted by the tariffs on both their imports and their exports? Because, what percentage of, I need to look at the data myself, what percentage of the industries are impacted by the import tariffs? And what percent of the industries in Kentucky are impacted by what we sell to other countries? Because that would impact the revenues, right?
So I have put data together for John Hicks and for the governor on this topic, and I have looked, obviously with our major exports, our major export partners, of course, are Canada and Mexico. Primarily, of course, for jet engines, automobile parts, glass, aluminum, chemicals, not horses, not bourbon. And if you look at the flip side, of course, our major trading partners coming in are China, Mexico, and Canada. So a tremendous amount of our activity. Now, there was a tremendous amount of front running. As you might imagine, we have had an incredible increase in our trade deficits with Ireland and the Netherlands because of pharmaceuticals. Now, while the pills are not large, the dollar amounts are. And so we have increased our trade deficits as a nation, not as much in Kentucky, of course, but as a nation tremendously, but I believe that was almost entirely with front running of the tariffs. So now we're down to more of the traditional production items. And I think you will see that reflected in the automobile industry and, of course, the other component parts, specifically aluminum and glass production. I will say the jet engine market, which while that is the largest single dollar amount of Kentucky exports, there is a lot going on with what is happening with Airbus and Boeing and delays in purchases, concerns of safety. So I believe a lot of those concerns and the contracting issues with that will be outside of the tariff regime for a while as they work through those items. But certainly when it comes to automobiles, lumber, and other products that we import from Canada, and again, automobile parts going back and forth between Mexico and Kentucky, we will see more of this. The trade data does run behind by about a quarter. If you would like, I can put together more information for this, for the December meeting, and show you some of the general trends. I usually don't take it past three numbers on the NAICS codes. So that usually captures all of our information well enough. But certainly, I would say that is something that is going to be, more data will be available by the time we get back in December. And do you mind if I address one other topic? As y'all know, unemployment insurance is kind of my big thing. That's what I did my PhD in. Also remember, we are looking at a lot of people nationally, not as much in Kentucky, but a lot of people nationally have exhausted their benefits. These people are now falling into the classic U6 definition of unemployment. They are no longer in the labor force looking for jobs. If you exhaust all benefits, and recall, Kentucky, much like other states, we no longer do the guaranteed up to 26 weeks. They have pulled back. Ours is done based on a 6-month lagging calculation of the unemployment rate. We are at 16 weeks maximum. And so that number will not change for quite some time. If we start to experience high unemployment, it won't be people who file for unemployment until another 6 months later that can get more benefits. And we have seen nationally the number of exhaustions increasing significantly. So people have exhausted their unemployment benefits. If they choose at that point to no longer seek a job, unemployment rates will not go up. They are now no longer in the numerator nor the denominator. And so we are seeing these impacts, especially in states that have pulled back on the number of weeks. The job search is taking longer, let alone the quality of the match that results from the benefits. The hazard models are showing these people exiting, and they are not choosing to remain in the labor force. And obviously, that is something that will be coming into play. And of course, we all know that with the call of many firms come back to the office and with higher unemployment rates, we would expect to see more pressure downward on wages and, of course, less flexibility given to the remote working situation that many employees are currently experiencing, making some of the jobs less appealing than they otherwise would be. So I just wanted to mention that because you had brought that up, Bruce. I'm sorry, Dr. Johnson. So.
I was just going to ask, does anybody have a proposal that they want to put out there?
I would propose just go 100% control.
Which, whatever we do today, is not going to have much of an impact on the state budget by the time we get to the end of the year.
And I'll bring my book back next time. So
Okay. All right.
I am too.
I made the change.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Consensus, control. Some people more optimistic or pessimistic, but for right now, it's not like we're doing a 2-year forecast, official forecast. Yep.
So, is that a consensus?
Sounds like. Janet, you, Alan? Yes. Kathy?
Yeah, I may
Okay,
disagree
okay.
in December.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you guys? Yeah. All right.
So I'm going to restate for posterity, the fiscal 26 estimate for the general fund is 15,349.7 million, and that will be an official revision, and that is precisely 305.2 million lower than the current official. The preliminary estimate for fiscal 27 is 15,706.2 million, which parenthetically is only about 50 million more than the old official estimate for 26. But anyway, the official estimate, the preliminary estimate, not the official estimate, the preliminary estimate for 27, 15,706.2, and for 28, the preliminary estimate is 16,066.9 million, and they're 2.3 and 2.3 growth in 27 and 28, and those will be the preliminary estimates and the official estimate for 26. Okay. Do we need a break before we go through road fund, or you want to go jump?
Drive on.
Drive on. Can you save that, Gene? Don't worry about it. It's just control.
Me.
Okay, so Greg talked about the actual versus estimate with the road fund as well earlier, so we'll skip over that. Before I get to the motor fuels, this is a graph of the last 10 years of total road fund revenue. The first 5 years fairly flat with it was a bit of a spike in fiscal 19, and then some pretty good growth and a fair amount of growth in 24. That's mainly from the motor fuels. We'll look at that, and then flat, actually slightly declining last year. So looking at the motor fuels revenue, You see the big spike in '24, where we went from just under $800 million to over $900 million. Prior to that, fuels were relatively flat. We do see the decline, the pandemic decline in 20 and 21. And the two components really that drive the fuels tax, of course, are the tax rate and consumption. And we'll see that the majority, the thing that explains it best is the tax rate, that the fuels consumption is fairly steady throughout time. So here is taxable motor fuels over the last 10 years. There is some growth in there, but it's really pretty flat when you look at like the out years where we had the growth in the motor fuels taxes. It comes from the change in the tax rate. So here are the tax rates for that time. From 16 through roughly 23, the gasoline tax rate was 26 cents. This is just the gasoline. The diesel, it's 3 cents less, but gasoline makes up the majority of the tax, so I usually just refer to the gasoline tax. You can see the red bar in fiscal 23. What happened was the tax rate was scheduled to go from 26 cents per gallon to 28 cents per gallon. This was a time with rising inflation and high gas prices. The governor issued an executive order to freeze the rate. It was in effect for the first 3 quarters. It expired. It was an emergency regulation, actually. So then for the last quarter of the year, the rate rose to 28 cents per gallon. It's important to know that it increased, or the rate at the end of the year was 28 cents, because the gas rate can, the increase in one year is based on where it ended the prior year. So it can go up to a maximum of 10%, or it can decline a maximum of 10% based on where what the rate was at the end of the year. So because the rate was 28 cents at the end of the year, it was able to go up another 2 cents to 2.1 cents to 30.1 cents in the following year. So the reason the revenue increased so much was we had a 4-cent increase for the first 9 months of the year and a 2-cent per gallon increase in the final quarter. That may not sound like much, but the working estimate is about $30 million per penny on an annual basis. So when you have 4-cent increase for 3 quarters of the year, you're going to get a large increase in revenues, and that's what we saw. It was about a $100 million increase from 23 to 24. U.S. retail gas prices are what I use to forecast the tax rate. When you see, for instance, that the rate or the prices were slightly declining, say in 26, or from 25 into 26, it's the calculation of the prior year. So whatever the calculated rate, average wholesale price of gasoline was in the prior year is what is in effect for the following year. It's also important to note that it's done quarterly. It's on the first month, so they do the calculations in July, October, January, and April. So it's really dependent on what the prices are in those 4 months rather than what they are in the other 8 months. That can make a big difference in the gas prices. So here are the gasoline tax rates. The rate has already been set for this year based on the average wholesale price last year. So it has declined for gasoline from 27.8 cents per gallon to 26.4 cents per gallon. The forecast calls for it to decline again in 27 with a slight increase in 28, just for the rates. Here is the consumption piece, fairly steady from after the pandemic, with slight declines in 27 and 28. So what do we see for the motor fuels taxes? Declines in 26 and 27, increase in 28. You'll notice that the control optimistic and pessimistic for the current year, there's not a big difference. That's because with the rate set and not a lot of changes in consumption, you're not going to get much variability between those forecasts. Looking at the motor vehicle usage tax, again, after 20, you can see a fairly big jump, and it just continued to increase each of these years from 21 through 25, all-time highs. We missed this. The forecast was for auto sales to start cooling off, and they just kept increasing, and so the motor vehicle usage tax increased. So what do we see going forward? Here's the consumer spending on light vehicles. You can see the pessimistic drops way down. Michael talked about this. The pessimistic forecast has the higher tariffs and the impact of those on motor vehicle sales. The average price of a new vehicle in that pessimistic forecast is much, much higher, which is going to lower the forecast for usage tax under the pessimistic scenario. The others, two scenarios are very similar, with some growth over the next couple of years. So the forecast for the current year under the control, basically flat, but still increasing, growing 3.3% in 27, 4.5% in 28. The pessimistic has declines for the next 2 years before increasing in 28. The other road fund taxes, the weight distance tax, this is the 2.85 cents per mile driven in Kentucky for the large, over 60,000 pound trucks. Not a lot of change in this. It's fairly steady. It's been 86 and $87 million the last couple of years. I use the Industrial Production Index on durable goods, control, and the optimistic forecasts increasing and leveling out, and again under the pessimistic scenario dropping in the current year and flat in 27 and 28. What does that look like? Slight decline in 26 and less than 2% growth under the control scenario for each of the next 2 years. Motor vehicle operators, this is your driver's license component of the tax. I went ahead and put in a longer history on this. You can see in these early years, didn't bring in very much money, $5.5 million, but very steady throughout. You can see in fiscal 06, the rate, the cost of that license increased. So the revenues went up, but still pretty steady. Not a lot of growth in this. That's different than what we're seeing in the last several years. I think the majority of that is coming from the Real ID. The Real ID is more expensive than the other license used to be. Over the last several years, the number of Real IDs that the Department of Transportation has issued has increased rapidly as it started in 2018 is when it was available. And I think they did just a handful, and each year it kept growing. Last year, I think it was right at 500,000. So we have the forecast for the motor vehicle operators growing a little bit in each of the next 3 years. This is the motor vehicle license tax, the revenue over the last several years. These are the license plate. When you pay to get your license plate, there is some variability in this. Greg talked about it when he talked about the one area that we missed by the most in the forecast. We have the truck proportion registration. These are trucks that drive in multi-taxing jurisdictions. It used to be they would file a return with every jurisdiction that they drove through. Now it's part of the IRP, the International Registration Plan, where they file a single return at a central agency, and then that money is distributed back out to the states. That tends to be fairly lumpy in here. It can range from $40 to $50 million, and that's where we see kind of these big spikes in some of these early years. So we just have a little bit of growth in this. It's hard to know when we're going to get the lower end of that money or the upper end. So it can range, about a $10 million difference, but we just have steady growth at the lower end for the next 3 years. The other revenue, that's just a handful of taxes and fees. We do have it going down in 26, 27, and 28. 25, fiscal 25 included the fee for electric and hybrid vehicles. In 24, that fee was $120 for an electric vehicle, $60 for the hybrid that had plug-in, or all hybrids. For this year, that fee has increased. It's changed. It increases annually based on the national highway construction cost. There's an index that's limited to 5% increase. So that is increased on the electric vehicles. However, the hybrids without plug-in capability have been eliminated from that. So they're no longer paying for that. If you have a hybrid with a plug-in, you're still going to be subject to that fee. So that's the hybrids without the plug-in capability made up the majority of that. So we're going to lose about $2.5 to $3 million on that account. That's the main reason that it's declining. There was another one-time fee in there that was about $1.5 million. That seems like it's non-recurring as best as we can tell. So that's the reason why we're lowering the forecast for the current year and with just a little bit of growth going forward. In terms of these all years, the current year under the control forecast is a decline of 2.8%, small decline in 27, and then growth in 28. That's the road fund, if anybody has any questions.
No.
Are we ready to consider have we been asked to revise the official forecast on the road fund as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm going to use my exact same logic, which is that currently, with 2 months in, the road fund grew by 0.4% over last year. The closest one of these to that is the optimistic one.
Okay. Anybody with a contrarian view to that?
The control works pretty well.
Yeah.
There's a little difference
Yeah.
in absolute dollars.
Does that mean therefore we go with 100% with the control?
Fine with me. I just want to be sure that I'm very consistent in my analysis.
I would agree with you, Chris, and I think when we come back in December, we're going to be like 5 months in, 6 months. So at that point, we can say like we are half of a year in. But for two different, generally, I've already said I'm more on the pessimistic side here, but I don't know why we would do for the road fund a different thing than we would do for the general fund. So if we did general, I would probably say control.
Going to restate that for posterity. Take the glasses off. The new official estimate for the road fund for 26 is $1,812.2 million, which is a 2.8% decline. And 27, the official estimate is $1,801.0 million, which is a 0.6% decline. And the preliminary estimate for fiscal 28 is $1,856.8, which is a 3.1 increase as the preliminary estimate for 27 and 28 for 28. So, new
the
offi- yes.
27 is a preliminary estimate. right?
27 is a preliminary estimate. I apologize if I said otherwise. And 26 is the only change to official. And that is a reduction of $82.1 million. And just to make the same comparison I made in the general fund, the estimate for 27 is quite a bit lower than the old official estimate for 26. The old official estimate for 26 was 1894.3. The new preliminary estimate for 27 is 1801.0. That was the same comparison I made in the general fund. Ready for the MSA? Yes.
Correct that we don't, the MSA is a non-voting matter, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And there's no revision.
All right, I have a time deadline, so before we do the master settlement agreement, could we pick our date that we have to have for December and do that first?
Yes, we've been asked, of course, to, if we're willing to do this, to select a date in advance for our December meeting. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Is there a particular time in December that works best for you all to get your numbers organized for us?
We'll accommodate whatever schedule.
Okay.
And just as a reminder, you must meet before December 20th,
Okay.
but per statute.
Okay, so December 19th would be the last. Just to make sure.
Is it before December 20th or by? We have to report by, if we reported on December 20th. So 20th. That's a little too close to the holidays.
20th is a Friday, I believe.
Finals week for me.
Is it?
I believe 20th is a Friday.
I thought it was a Saturday, but
Which date? What date?
Just throughout
December 9? Okay, let's see. Can't
I
be,
think that's before finals for us, isn't it? You don't know. You don't care. Not good for you.
I can't do that.
Is that week bad for you?
I'm in Louisville all day. What about the 8th?
I can't do the 8th.
9th is good for me now.
9th. I like the 9th.
Dynamic over here.
Anytime in that 15th through the 19th is, I think we're all out by then.
Yes, but I don't want to be doing this then.
We have a consensus on that.
Friday.
Fridays are bad.
I heard a vote for the 9th in the morning. Is that fit anybody?
I can't.
No, that doesn't work for John.
Okay. 11th in the morning?
I'm like you, that's just a really bad week.
11th is bad.
Did we do the 15th?
I could do the 15th in the afternoon. I have to give an exam then.
16th would be better for me, but we could.
I could do the 15th or the 16th.
Could do 16 in the morning. Can you do 16 in the morning?
Yeah, I think I can do 16 in the morning.
We may have a day.
So the morning of December 16th, does that work for everybody?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. So December 16th.
So are we thinking that's a longer meeting? Because if it's morning, what is morning?
Well, it means we start at 9 and we apparently end sometime around 1.
Well, we laid some groundwork in this meeting that we won't have to relay in December, so I can't make any promises,
pretty
but I think our material's gonna be less in December.
Right, so we could spend much less time on what we went over today in more detail
Yes.
than we would normally have done
Sure.
already. So
Yes.
what has changed? Just focus on
What has changed?
what has happened since we issued this forecast, and what do we know? Do we have we'll have a better idea, I think, of what things might look like going forward at that point in terms of policy and.
You think so?
Well,
More than what we know right now.
Yeah, I think there'll be less material because the introductory remarks will be cut way back, and you're right. If we focus between the differences between September and December, that will go much more quickly.
And I assume as well, I could be wrong, but I don't know if you have to do this for the recording, unless you're changing all your models, knowing the REMA and all of that, we already know that now, right? So all of that won't be necessary to go through necessarily?
Correct.
Okay.
Except the forecast you'll be using in those models will change.
Yes.
Right, what's feeding into it will
Yeah.
change.
yeah,
So you're gonna hold models constant, but feed in.
That's
is
right.
different.
Most likely, yes.
I mean, some of the fits won't fit anymore, but
Yeah. Who knows, an MA16 may not work next time.
I'll place my bets on it.
So,
I said 4 years. So you're saying 4 years back?
the shock of presidential elections. Who knew it could have such an impact on sales tax?
That's the first thing popped in my head.
That's right. All right, well, I will very quickly no longer stand between you and being done and go through the MSA.
on with it.
All right. And which, because I have done this so many times, I'm going to very quickly skip over because you've all seen this presentation many a time. Specifically for fiscal 25, we received $100.4 million, which was just ever so slightly more than the forecasted amount. That brings our grand total under the MSA to $2.87 billion in payments to the Commonwealth. There are multiple components. You may recall that to be conservative, we held steady at the 3% minimum inflation growth rate with a wink and a nod towards the fact that it could be higher. Ended up not being higher. It was 3%, and it is unusual. The MSA uses December over December CPI, all urban consumer annual growth changes. I have not deviated from that. While we have been looking at the inflation forecasts, I see no reason to build anything other than the minimum 3% inflation growth rate. The big impact, of course, has been volumes, just like we talked about under the cigarette tax. And because of the decline in volumes, you can see that the current preliminary estimates are $90.2 million for fiscal 26, $83.7 million for fiscal 27, and $78.5 million for fiscal 28. These numbers will hold, again, the assumptions made up to now, so long as we do not see declines in cigarette consumption shipments nationwide. Remember, the MSA is for nationwide shipments greater than a 10% annual reduction. If we start to see evidence of greater than 10%, these numbers, of course, will go down. And conversely, if cigarette consumption picks up, these numbers would go up slightly. But right now, this is my best estimate because I do not forecast or do not foresee any additional adjustments or changes to the current structure of the MSA settlements that we have signed on to during the next biennial period.
And keep in mind that this fiscal 26 estimate is not an official revision.
Correct. Then I will close by saying what I always say. I hope to see you all at the KEA in October. As the treasurer, I must say this.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you to you and your staff.